What makes the Laconia incident genuinely difficult to categorize is that it begins as a standard act of submarine warfare and within 48 hours becomes something that has no clean precedent in the naval history of the Second World War. A German U-boat commander broadcasting his position in plain English to any Allied ship within radio range, flying Red Cross flags from his periscope and towing lifeboats containing survivors through South Atlantic waters, while simultaneously requesting that enemy forces come and collect them. The sequence of events that follows that request, and the command decision it eventually triggers from U-boat headquarters in Lorient, permanently alters the rules under which German submarines fight the rest of the war. The ship that sinks on September 12, 1942, is RMS Laconia, a British ocean liner converted to a troopship displacing roughly 19,600 tons. She is sailing from Suez toward Britain carrying 2,732 people, a mix of British servicemen, civilian passengers including women and children, Polish soldiers, and 1,800 Italian prisoners of war held in her lower decks under armed guard. She is traveling without convoy escort at a speed of approximately 14 knots, relying on her pace and the vastness of the South Atlantic to avoid submarines. The U-boat that finds her is U-156, a Type 9C submarine displacing roughly 1,100 tons, surfaced and commanded by Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein. At approximately 10 past 10 on the night of September 12th, Hartenstein fires 2 torpedoes. Both hit. The first detonates against Laconia's starboard side amidships. The second strikes moments later. A ship carrying nearly 2,800 people begins sinking in the South Atlantic, roughly 800 miles southwest of Freetown, Sierra Leone.
The torpedoes do what torpedoes are designed to do, with mechanical indifference to who is aboard.
In the immediate chaos of the sinking, lifeboats are lowered, many of them overcrowded or damaged. The Italian prisoners locked below decks fight through flooding compartments toward any exit they can find. Some drown before reaching the upper decks. Others reach the water and grab wreckage. The South Atlantic at that latitude sits at roughly 80 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that immersion does not immediately kill, which means survivors remain alive in the water for hours, which means the scale of the rescue problem grows rather than contracts as Hartenstein surfaces to assess the situation. What he finds in the water around U-156 changes every calculation he brought to the surface with him. Hundreds of people, men, women, children, Allied servicemen, and Italian soldiers whose country is technically Germany's ally, are in the water simultaneously. The screaming and calling from the darkness is audible across the submarine's deck. Hartenstein begins pulling survivors aboard. His crew hauls people out of the South Atlantic onto a submarine that measures roughly 76 meters in length and is designed to carry a crew of 48 men in conditions that already border on the physically brutal. Within hours, U-156 carries roughly 190 survivors on deck and in tow, with more lifeboats roped behind the submarine. Hartenstein sends a signal to U-boat command. Then he does something that sits outside the operational parameters of submarine warfare entirely. He transmits in plain, unencrypted English on the international distress frequency, identifying himself as a German submarine, giving his position, stating he has Laconia survivors aboard, including Italian nationals, and requesting that any ship, regardless of nationality, come to assist provided U-156 is not attacked during the rescue operation. The transmission is an act of military exposure so complete that it reads almost like a different kind of courage than combat requires. Admiral Karl Donitz, commanding U-boat operations from Lorient, receives Hartenstein's signal and faces a command problem with no clean solution. Diverting submarines to a rescue operation in the South Atlantic exposes them to air and surface attack. It removes operational boats from patrol zones where they are sinking Allied tonnage. It potentially hands the enemy intelligence about U-boat positions and operational methods. But the survivors include Italian nationals, Germany's allies, and abandoning them while a German commander has already begun their rescue carries its own consequences in terms of the alliance relationship with Rome. Donitz sends 3 more submarines toward the Laconia position. U-506, U-507, and the Italian submarine Capellini all converge on the rescue operation across the following days, collectively taking on survivors and towing lifeboats across a stretch of South Atlantic that measures hundreds of miles from the nearest friendly port. The submarines tow lifeboats containing hundreds of survivors through open ocean for days. Inside U-156 during those hours, the physical conditions compress beyond what the vessel's designers imagined. Survivors crowd every available surface above and below decks. The submarine's food and water supplies, calculated for a crew of 48 on a patrol of several weeks, now support a population several times that size. The boat's mechanical systems, bilge pumps, ventilation, electrical systems, operate under strain while the crew attempts to maintain basic navigational function with hundreds of exhausted, traumatized, and in some cases injured people distributed across a vessel with no capacity to accommodate them. The Red Cross flags fly from the conning tower. On September 16th, 4 days after the sinking, a United States Army B-24 Liberator, operating from Ascension Island, locates the submarine and the towed lifeboats. The pilot, Captain Robert Richardson, circles the scene, observes the rescue operation, reports to base, and receives orders to attack. 2 attacks follow. Bombs fall near U-156 and the lifeboats she is towing. One attack forces Hartenstein to cast off the tow lines and dive to avoid destruction, leaving the lifeboats adrift in open ocean. The attack on a submarine flying Red Cross flags while conducting a rescue operation generates a controversy that persists in naval historical literature for decades. The American command's position is that a submarine is a legitimate military target, regardless of the flags it displays and the activity it appears to be conducting, since there is no way to verify from an aircraft that the operation is genuine rather than a trap. The operational logic has internal coherence. The human consequence is that survivors who are being towed toward eventual rescue are cast adrift again in the South Atlantic. I went through the American after-action reports from that attack and the subsequent Board of Inquiry documents while researching this period of the Atlantic campaign. What struck me was not the decision itself. The military reasoning, however harsh, follows a traceable logic. But the gap between the operational language of those documents and what the attack actually means in physical terms for the people in those lifeboats when the tow lines are cut and the submarine dives. Donitz issues the Laconia Order on September 17, 1942. The order instructs U-boat commanders that rescue of survivors, retrieving them from the water, handing them food and water, delivering them to lifeboats, is prohibited. The reasoning Donitz gives is operational. Rescue attempts expose submarines to the exact attack that nearly destroyed U-156, and the primary mission of the submarine fleet is the destruction of Allied shipping, not humanitarian operations that place boats and crews at risk. The order becomes one of the charges against Donitz at the Nuremberg trials. The Allied prosecutors argue it constitutes an order to kill survivors. Donitz, in his defense, argue it is an order to cease rescue operations for operational safety reasons, not an instruction to actively kill people in the water. The tribunal ultimately finds the distinction partially valid. Donitz is convicted on other charges, but the Laconia Order itself does not produce a finding of criminal guilt, partly because the American Navy had issued comparable directives regarding rescue operations in the Pacific Theater. That legal parallel does not resolve the moral question. It simply distributes it more widely. The survivors of Laconia are eventually rescued by the French ships Gloire and Annamite, arriving days after the submarines are forced to abandon the operation. Of the 2,732 people aboard Laconia when the torpedoes hit, roughly 1,691 survive. 1,041 people die, many of them the Italian prisoners who could not reach the decks before the flooding reached them. The Laconia Incident does not fit the narrative categories that make wartime events easy to process. A German submarine commander exposing himself to destruction to rescue enemy survivors. An Allied aircraft attacking a rescue operation. A German admiral issuing an order that saves his submarines and abandons people in the South Atlantic. a war crimes tribunal finding partial exoneration on a charge that the historical record makes genuinely ambiguous. Every element of this story resists the clean moral framing that most Second World War narratives reach for, and that resistance is precisely why it remains one of the most argued-over single incidents in the entire Atlantic campaign.
If the night is quiet around you now, and you find yourself somewhere comfortable, letting these details layer into something heavier than you expected, picture the South Atlantic on the night of September 12, 1942. Darkness, warm water, nearly 2,800 people suddenly in the ocean around a sinking ship measuring almost 200 meters. A German submarine surfaces in the middle of it. The commander looks at what is in the water and makes a decision that takes his boat out of the war for 4 days and nearly gets it destroyed. This is the entire history of the Laconia Incident, the U-boat rescue mission that permanently changed the rules of the Atlantic War. There's a ship sitting at the bottom of the South Atlantic Ocean, roughly 4,230 meters below the surface, deeper than the Titanic, deeper than most of the war's famous wrecks. More people died aboard her than died on the Titanic, and for decades, almost nobody talked about it. The name of the ship was the RMS Laconia, and what happened to her, and what happened after she sank, changed the rules of naval warfare for the rest of the 20th century, and well into our own time. This is that story. The ship that refused to stay ordinary. She was built at Wallsend on the River Tyne by Swan, Hunter, and Wigham Richardson Limited, the same yard that had built some of the most distinguished ships in British maritime history. The keel was laid during the final years of the First World War, and she was launched on the 9th of April, 1921. Her measurements were precise and substantial: 601 feet 3 inches in length, a beam of 73 feet and 7 inches, and a draft of 32 feet and 8 inches. 6 steam turbines, built by the Wallsend Slipway and Engineering Company just down the road from where she was assembled, drove her twin propellers through a double reduction gearing system that delivered a service speed of 16 knots. Her gross registered tonnage came in at 19,695. She wasn't the largest ship afloat, but she was a serious vessel, designed to carry 350 first-class passengers, 350 second-class, and 1,500 in third-class, plus refrigerated cargo space of more than 54,000 cubic feet. She was, in every measurable sense, a machine built for peacetime comfort. Her maiden voyage departed Southampton on the 25th of May, 1922, bound for New York. Her primary commercial route was the Liverpool to Boston to New York transatlantic run, and she did it reliably, season after season, in the way that well-engineered machinery tends to do when nobody's shooting at it. But the moment that first defined the Laconia's character, the moment I keep returning to when I think about what kind of ship she actually was, came not on the transatlantic run, but on the 21st of November, 1922, when she departed on an around-the-world cruise chartered by the American Express Company, carrying 347 passengers. That voyage lasted 130 days and called at 22 ports. It was, by subsequent historical reckoning, the first continuous circumnavigation of the globe by a passenger liner. The Laconia became famous not as a battleship, not as a troop carrier, not as a weapon of any kind, but as a vehicle for leisure. That matters. It matters in a way that the tonnage figures alone can't convey. She had collisions, as large ships sometimes do. On the 8th of September, 1925, she struck the British schooner Lucia P. Dow in the Atlantic Ocean, 60 nautical miles east of Nantucket. What the Laconia did next is documented and worth remembering. She took the damaged schooner under tow and hauled her 120 nautical miles before handing the line to the American tug Resolute. A liner stopping to help a schooner. It's a small thing in the ledger of maritime history, but it's a detail that sits in the record, verifiable, and it tells you something about the operational culture that existed aboard that ship. Then, on the 24th of September, 1934, she collided with the American freighter Pan Royal in dense fog off the United States coast, traveling from Boston to New York. Both ships were seriously damaged. Both proceeded under their own steam. The Laconia returned to New York for repairs and was back in service by 1935. She was, it seemed, a ship that absorbed damage and kept moving. That quality would be tested again. When war came in September 1939, the Admiralty didn't ask for the Laconia. It simply took her. On the 4th of September 1939, she was requisitioned and conversion to an armed merchant cruiser began almost immediately. By January 1940, she had been fitted with 8 6-inch guns and 2 3-inch high-angle anti-aircraft guns. Those specifications are worth holding in your mind because they become legally and morally significant later. 8 6-inch guns is not decorative armament. That is a weapons fit that, under the maritime law of the era, placed her squarely in the category of legitimate military targets, a fact that Werner Hartenstein would later cite with what sounds like genuine regret in a conversation with a British survivor. After trials off the Isle of Wight, she was put to convoy escort work in the Atlantic, running between Bermuda and mid-ocean rendezvous points. She ran aground in Halifax in June of 1940, suffered considerable damage, was repaired, and kept going. In October of that year, an unusual modification was made. Her passenger accommodation was partly dismantled, and some internal areas were filled with oil drums to provide extra buoyancy, the explicit intent being to keep her afloat longer if torpedoed. Someone, somewhere in the Admiralty, was thinking ahead about what would happen when, not if, she got hit. The second conversion came in the summer of 1941. Between June and August of that year, the Laconia returned to St. John, New Brunswick for a full refit, then sailed back to Liverpool. On the 12th of September 1941, exactly 1 year to the day before she was sunk, she arrived at Bidston Dock in Birkenhead and was taken over by Camel Laird and Company for conversion into a full troopship. The work was completed by early 1942, and for the next 6 months she made trooping voyages to the Middle East. Her passenger accommodation was gone, her cargo holds had been adapted. She was no longer a liner in any operational sense. She was a transport, a vehicle for moving soldiers, supplies, and, as it turned out, prisoners of war across thousands of miles of contested ocean. It's worth pausing on this transformation because it happened in steps, each one reasonable in isolation, each one moving her further from what she was designed to be. The engineers who drew her plans at Wall's End in 1919 could not have imagined this sequence. A world cruise ship, then a convoy escort, then a troop transport, now carrying nearly 1,800 Italian prisoners in her holds. The same hull, the same turbines, a completely different purpose. Her final manifest, assembled for the voyage that began in Cape Town and was bound for Freetown and then Britain, reflects a human cargo of extraordinary complexity. There were 463 officers and crew. There were 87 civilians, women, nurses, some with children. There were 286 British military personnel, many of them returning home from service, several of them injured. There were 103 Polish soldiers serving as guards for the prisoners, and there were 1,793 Italian prisoners of war, captured primarily during the North African campaign, most of them held in the lower cargo holds. The total complement was 2,732 people. What I find remarkable, and I use that word carefully because it's the kind of detail that gets lost in the headline casualty figures, is the sheer administrative complexity of managing that manifest on a ship that was never designed for it. This wasn't a prison ship. It was a converted liner with oil drums in the walls, carrying almost 1,800 prisoners in spaces that had been built for refrigerated cargo. The human logistics of that situation were, before a single torpedo was fired, already extremely fragile. Commanding her was Captain Rudolph Sharp. And here is where the history gets uncomfortable in a way that most accounts skip over. Sharp had previously commanded the RMS Lancastria, another Cunard liner requisitioned for wartime service. On the 17th of June, 1940, the Lancastria was bombed by German aircraft off the French port of Saint-Nazaire during Operation Ariel, the evacuation of British nationals and troops from France. She sank in roughly 20 minutes. The death toll has never been precisely established, but the most conservative serious estimates place it at no fewer than 3,500 people, with some estimates running to over 4,000. It was the largest single-vessel loss of life in British maritime history. Churchill ordered the news suppressed. The families weren't told for months, and Rudolph Sharp survived it. He was pulled from the water, recovered, and given another ship. There was no formal inquiry into his conduct, at least none that appears in the accessible record. He was simply given the Laconia and sent back to sea. I've spent time looking at this sequence, and I genuinely don't know whether that represents confidence in Sharp as a commander or an institutional failure to process what had happened aboard the Lancastria. The record doesn't say. It just moves on. By the southern winter of 1942, the Laconia was on one of the most important Allied shipping routes in the Atlantic, the Cape Town to Freetown corridor that connected South African logistics with the West African ports that fed supplies north toward Egypt and east toward India. Sharp had been given specific orders, according to the documentary record, to keep the ship well away from the African coast, where U-boat activity was known to be concentrated. He was also ordered to maintain a zigzag course during darkness and take evasive action. The Laconia was armed, which made her a legitimate target. She was fast enough, at 16 knots, to outrun some submarines in certain conditions, but she was traveling alone, no convoy, no escort, because the Royal Navy's escort resources in the South Atlantic in September 1942 were stretched to breaking point. Those are the conditions: a large, armed, convoyless ship, heavily loaded with people she wasn't built to carry, in the middle of one of the most actively patrolled stretches of ocean in the world. The setup for catastrophe was structural, not coincidental. What the Laconia couldn't know, and what makes the geography of what followed so precise, was that roughly 900 miles to the south of Freetown, a group of German submarines had assembled for what was intended to be one of the most audacious naval strikes of the entire Atlantic campaign. The operation was called Ice Bear, Polar Bear, and it involved 5 long-range Type 9C U-boats gathered for a surprise assault on Cape Town Harbor. They were moving south, maintaining strict radio silence, when one of them, patrolling in the grid square designated FF7721 in the German naval chart system, spotted a large northbound vessel just after 10 o'clock at night on the 12th of September, 1942. The vessel was running without lights, standard wartime practice, and it was armed. To the submarine commander who spotted her, it was, by every legal and operational criterion that existed in 1942, a legitimate target. He fired 2 torpedoes. The first struck at approximately 10:22 in the evening. The second followed seconds later. And the sequence of events that followed, the rescue, the bombing, the order, and the legal aftermath, would rewrite the rules of submarine warfare for the rest of the century. The Laconia sank, bow first, at approximately 11:23 that night, 1 hour and 1 minute after the first torpedo struck. In that hour, passengers had scrambled for lifeboats on a ship listing so severely that half her lifeboat davits were rendered inoperable by the angle of the hull. Prisoners who had been locked in the lower holds fought their way out through broken hatches and ventilation shafts. The sea around the ship was full of people, and on the surface, a few hundred meters away, the submarine that had sunk her sat still in the water, its commander on the conning tower, listening. He could hear voices calling out in Italian. He could see, in the darkness, something he had not expected. Not a military transport shedding a crew of soldiers, but a catastrophe of a scale he hadn't anticipated, involving people he hadn't planned to kill. What he did next was entirely outside his operational orders, and it would change everything. Wolfpack Arithmetic, the Type 9C, and the South Atlantic Patrol. To understand why 5 specific German submarines were in that specific patch of ocean on the 12th of September, 1942, You have to go back to Lorient on the French Atlantic coast, specifically to the concrete bunker complex on the Karaman Peninsula, where the Befehlshaber der U-Boote, the headquarters of German Submarine Command, had been operating since the fall of France in 1940. That headquarters ran with the bureaucratic precision of a well-organized logistics department. Patrol routes were planned on gridded charts, fuel states were tracked against mission objectives, and operational orders were issued and tracked through a war diary that was updated, in theory, every few hours. When I was working through the secondary literature on the ISBAR operation, cross-referencing with the fuel and range data for the Type 9C boats, I kept being struck by how close-run the whole thing was. How the decision to send these specific submarines south on this specific timeline created a geographic coincidence that nobody in Lorient had modeled or anticipated. The Type 9C was the workhorse of Germany's long-range submarine operations. She displaced 1,120 tons on the surface and 1,232 tons when submerged. Her two MAN diesel engines, each rated at 2,170 horsepower, drove her at just over 18 knots on the surface. Submerged, she could manage roughly 7.5 knots on her electric motors before her batteries demanded a return to the surface for recharging. Her operational range was approximately 11,000 nautical miles at 10 knots on the surface, enough to reach Cape Town from a Biscay base with fuel to spare for sustained patrol operations, provided the transit was efficient. She carried a crew of between 48 and 56 men, depending on the specific boat and its complement of officers. And she was armed with 22 torpedoes, 14 in the forward tubes and 8 in the stern, plus a 105mm deck gun and a range of anti-aircraft weapons. The torpedo complement alone represents a significant strategic investment. Each G7E or G7A torpedo, depending on type, contained approximately 300 kilograms of explosive in its warhead. The Type 9C wasn't a coastal raider. She was a true oceanic predator, built for campaigns measured in weeks and thousands of miles. The 5 boats assembled for ISBAR, and it's important to note that the operation's timing and composition are documented in Donitz's war diary as cited by historian Clay Blair in his comprehensive 1998 study, departed their Biscay bases on staggered schedules between the 3rd and 7th of September 1942. The staggering was deliberate. It reduced the signature of the operation and allowed the boats to spread their transit paths to avoid Allied air coverage. Radio silence was enforced strictly from departure. That instruction, strict, appears in the operational record as a categorical requirement. No routine position reports, no status updates. The boats were ghosts, moving south through the Atlantic at 8 to 10 knots, conserving fuel, running on the surface in the hours of darkness, and submerging during daylight when Allied aircraft were the primary threat. The transit from the Bay of Biscay to the waters off Cape Town is roughly 8,000 nautical miles. At 10 knots, that's approximately 33 days of continuous passage. These submarines were not in the South Atlantic by accident. They were where a considerable amount of German naval planning had put them. The strategic logic behind ISBAR was straightforward and, in its own terms, sound. Cape Town in 1942 was one of the most important Allied logistics nodes in the entire Southern Hemisphere. It was the primary port through which supplies moved from the Americas and Britain to Egypt, to India, and to the Soviet Union via the Cape route, the alternative to the Mediterranean, which was heavily contested. A surprise U-boat assault on shipping in Cape Town Harbor and the surrounding approaches could, in theory, disrupt that logistics flow at a moment when it was genuinely critical. The 8th Army in Egypt was preparing for what would become the Second Battle of El Alamein, scheduled for late October, and its supply situation was a constant source of anxiety in London and Cairo. The 5 ISBAR boats were not an incidental patrol group. They were, in the strategic calculus of September 1942, a potentially decisive force. That's the context in which the sinking of the Laconia needs to be understood, not as a random event in an empty ocean, but as an interruption of a carefully planned operation by a target that presented itself in exactly the right place at exactly the wrong moment. On the night of the 12th of September, U-156, commanded by Korvettenkapitan Werner Hartenstein, 34 years old, a highly experienced officer credited by this point in the war with sinking 19 ships, totaling approximately 97,500 tons, was running at roughly 8 knots in grid square FF 7721, approximately 210 kilometers north-northeast of Ascension Island. At around 10 past 10 in the evening, his lookout spotted a large vessel heading north. The standard operational calculation was swift. The ship was large, she was traveling alone, and the converted armament she was carrying made her a valid target under the prize rules and the laws of naval warfare as then understood. At 22 minutes past 10, the Laconia transmitted her distress signal on the 600-meter frequency. SSS 0434 South, 1125 West. Laconia torpedoed. The signal code SSS denoted attack by submarine. It was received by no vessel or station that subsequently acted on it. Then the ship began to sink. What happened during the approximately 60 minutes that elapsed between the torpedo strikes and the Laconia's final plunge is one of the more chaotic and harrowing sequences in this entire story, and the sources are, frankly, contradictory in their details. What is consistent across accounts is the structural fact. The ship's immediate and severe list to starboard, caused by the torpedo strikes, meant that half of her 32 lifeboats couldn't be launched until the vessel had settled somewhat. The prisoners in the lower holds were in a locked, flooding space with no access to the deck. The Polish guards, 103 men with rifles but, critically, no ammunition, because it was British transport policy to keep guard rifles unloaded as a security precaution, were attempting to manage the impossible. The lifeboat deck was overcrowded and panicked, and the sea around the ship, as people entered the water in the darkness, was almost immediately full of people calling for help. Hartenstein, on the conning tower of U-156, as she surfaced to look for senior officers to capture, standard procedure, heard something he hadn't expected. Italian. The voices in the water were calling out in Italian. He understood what that meant. These weren't just the crew of a British troopship. A significant portion of the people dying in the water around him were Italian prisoners of war, Allied nationals of a state that was, at this moment in September 1942, fighting alongside Germany across the Mediterranean, in North Africa, and in the Eastern Atlantic. Whatever the precise sequence of his reasoning, and we can't reconstruct his interior state, only his actions, what is documented is what he did. He began pulling people from the water. His crew lowered lines and dragged exhausted, oil-covered survivors onto the submarine's deck. By 1:25 in the morning of the 13th of September, with 90 people already aboard and more in the water, he composed a coded signal to Donitz's headquarters. Sunk by Hartenstein, British Laconia, grid FF 7721, 310 degrees. Unfortunately, with 1,500 Italian POWs, 90 fished out so far, 157 cubic meters oil remaining, 19 torpedoes remaining. Request orders. The word he used, lighter, unfortunately, is not naval procedure. It's not a word that appears in operational reporting formats. It's a word that means something happened that he hadn't intended, and he wanted his commanding officer to know it. Donitz's response was swift, and it tells you something about the strategic calculation involved. He initially moved to divert multiple boats from the Eisbar Wolfpack to assist with the rescue. That decision brought him into direct conflict with Adolf Hitler, who received the news and ordered the rescue abandoned. The Cape Town operation was too valuable to compromise. Admiral Raeder, the commander-in-chief of the German Navy, mediated. The Eisbar boats would be released for their original mission, but 2 additional submarines already operating near Freetown, U-506 and U-507, would be diverted to assist Hartenstein. The Italian submarine Comandante Capellini was also ordered to the scene. The Vichy French were contacted through diplomatic channels and asked to send surface vessels. In the space of a few hours, what had been a standard wartime sinking had become a multinational naval rescue operation being coordinated from a bunker in Lorient, running against direct orders from the Führer's headquarters in Berlin. The bureaucratic friction alone is extraordinary. The human consequences were only just beginning. The critical point that tends to get lost in the drama of what followed is the one that the operational data makes plain. The Ice Bear operation against Cape Town was effectively aborted by the Laconia rescue. The Cape Town attack had been timed for early to mid-October. With the Ice Bear boats delayed, redistributed, and their radio silence broken, the operational window closed. The surprise was gone. The harbor assault that might, and it's a genuine might, not a certainty, have disrupted the supply chain to the 8th Army in the weeks before El Alamein never happened. Montgomery fought his battle with his logistics intact. Whether the Laconia rescue was, in some indirect and unquantifiable way, a factor in that outcome is a question the historians haven't fully engaged with, perhaps because it doesn't fit neatly into any nation's preferred narrative. But the geography and the timing make it worth asking. There's one more data point that the operational records preserve, and it's the one I find myself returning to most often when I think about this chapter of the story. Hartenstein's initial signal to headquarters, sent at 1:25 in the morning, listed his fuel state precisely: 157 cubic meters of diesel oil remaining. That's a standard operational detail. Fuel state is always reported. It's how headquarters tracks operational endurance. But in this specific signal, that number sits directly next to the word lighter. 157 cubic meters, 19 torpedoes, 90 people pulled from the water, a request for orders, the arithmetic of a submarine at war, interrupted by the arithmetic of a catastrophe it had caused. The two things sit in the same sentence, in the same transmission, in the same handwriting. That's the document. That's where this story really begins. What the Holds Heard. There is a way of telling the story of the Laconia that focuses almost exclusively on the surface, on the lifeboats, on the submarines, on the radio signals, on the diplomatic maneuvering. It's a useful frame for the strategic narrative, but it leaves out the majority of the people who died. Of the 1,658 to 1,757 people killed when the Laconia sank, the best available estimates suggest that approximately 1,420 were Italian prisoners of war. That figure represents, depending on which end of the casualty range you use, somewhere between 80 and 86% of the total dead. And almost all of them were in the lower holds of the ship when the torpedoes struck. This chapter is about what that experience was, to the degree that the surviving accounts allow us to reconstruct it. And it's deliberately slower, more confined, and less strategic than the chapters that surround it, because that's what being in the holds was: confined, unstrategic, and very slow to end. The Italian prisoners aboard the Laconia in September 1942 were primarily men captured during the North African campaign, soldiers of the Italian army who had been taken prisoner during the fighting in Libya and Egypt, processed through prisoner-of-war camps in the Middle East and South Africa, and were now being transported north toward Britain and ultimately toward detention camps. The formal category in British military records was Italian Army prisoners of war, repatriated under escort. 1,793 of them had boarded the Laconia at Cape Town, under the custody of those 103 Polish guards. They were assigned to the lower cargo holds, spaces that had been adapted from the original refrigerated cargo configuration, fitted with basic bunks or sleeping platforms, and secured with locked hatches that could, in an emergency, be opened from the outside by the guard personnel. That detail, locked from outside, is the critical architectural fact of what happened on the night of the 12th of September. The prisoners couldn't get out on their own. They needed someone to open the hatches for them. And in the chaos that followed the torpedo strikes, with the ship listing, the lights failing, and the guard personnel dealing with the same chaos as everyone else on the ship, that didn't happen fast enough for most of them. Corporal Dino Monte, one of the Italian survivors, gave a deposition to the Italian Military Historical Office in Rome that was preserved and later translated and cited in the Italian scholarly literature. His testimony is one of the very few direct accounts of what it was like to be in the lower holds when the torpedoes struck, and it's worth taking seriously as a primary document rather than simply as color for the narrative. The holds were already cramped and poorly ventilated. The Laconia's refrigerated cargo spaces were not designed for human habitation, and nearly 1,800 men in those spaces in the South Atlantic heat would have produced an atmosphere that was, before any disaster, uncomfortable and close. The explosion, when it came, struck one of the lower areas directly adjacent to where prisoners were concentrated. Many died instantly. Those who survived the initial strike found themselves in a flooding, listing dark space with locked exits and approximately 1,000 companions in various states of panic, injury, and confusion. Monte's testimony describes what followed in terms that are spare and precise and deeply difficult to read. The survival routes for the Italian prisoners were not designed ones. They were improvised and structural. Men who were close to the ventilation shafts climbed them. The Laconia's cargo hold ventilation system, built to Board of Trade specifications for commercial vessels in the 19-teens, consisted of circular trunk shafts running vertically from hold level to the weather deck, fitted with cowl vents at the top. A fit man could, in theory, navigate one of those shafts to reach the open air. In the dark, with the ship listing, with water rising and hundreds of men competing for the same exits, the practical reality of that escape route was brutal. Some men made it, many didn't. Others escaped through hatches that were eventually opened, either by guards who got there in time or by prisoners who forced the hatches themselves. The ship had been listing for some time before she finally sank, and that interval, the approximately 60 minutes between the first torpedo strike and the final plunge, is the window in which some fraction of the Italian prisoners got out. The guards themselves, the Polish soldiers of the escort contingent, were in an impossible position that has received almost no serious historical attention. 103 men, armed with rifles fitted with fixed bayonets, carrying no ammunition, responsible for nearly 1,800 prisoners in a sinking ship. The standing order to maintain unloaded weapons was a peacetime security protocol designed to prevent a prisoner of war hijacking of a vessel. Nobody in the British Transport Administration had revised it to account for a torpedo strike at night in the South Atlantic. When prisoners began rushing toward the lifeboat stations, the guards had two options: stand aside or use their bayonets. Some used their bayonets. Multiple survivor accounts confirm this, though the accounts differ on the scale and on the specific circumstances, and I'm not going to resolve that conflict here, because the primary sources genuinely don't allow a clean resolution. What the sources do agree on is that the Polish guards were operating under orders, with inadequate equipment, in a situation their chain of command had never planned for. That's the institutional failure. The individuals in that situation were trying to manage the unmanageable. The sea temperature in that stretch of the South Atlantic in September is approximately 25 to 26 degrees Celsius, warm enough that hypothermia wasn't the immediate threat for people in the water, but warm enough also to attract the large oceanic sharks that patrol those waters. The Laconia's sinking had produced an enormous amount of blood, oil, and noise in the water. Monte's testimony includes the description that has become the most cited passage from the Italian survivor record. Sharks darted among us, grabbing an arm, biting a leg. Other larger beasts swallowed entire bodies. That's a survivor's account, not a scientific observation, and it should be read as such. But the presence of sharks in the waters around a major sinking in the warm equatorial Atlantic is not in question. It's confirmed across multiple survivor accounts from multiple nationalities, and the Animal Planet documentary on the Laconia Incident, which consulted marine biologists on the species and behavior involved, treated it as an established fact of the survival situation. The specific species most likely present in those coordinates, oceanic white-tip sharks, Carcharinus longimanus, are known to be particularly active around open ocean disasters. They had been there before. They were there that night. What is often not fully reckoned with in accounts of the Laconia rescue is the specific survival arithmetic for the Italian prisoners, as distinct from the other groups aboard. Of the 1,793 Italians who embarked at Cape Town, approximately 415 were eventually rescued. The Wikipedia record citing the uboat.net data gives this figure. That is a survival rate of roughly 23%. The British and Polish personnel aboard had significantly higher survival rates. The mechanisms that locked the Italians below decks, literally and architecturally, were not applied to the soldiers and crew who were on the upper decks when the torpedoes struck. The differential isn't about individual courage or individual choice. It's about where each group was standing when the ship got hit, and who had control of the locks. The wreck of the Laconia lies at 4,230 meters, in grid square FF7721, at approximately 5 degrees south and 11 degrees west. That depth places it well below any practical salvage capability with current technology. The Italian prisoners who died in the lower holds are still there. They have never been formally retrieved. Italy has never mounted a government-level memorial expedition to the site. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission has records for British and Polish casualties. You can find them by name, with dates and service numbers. The Italian dead are listed differently, as a collective, in aggregate, with far less individual documentation. 1,420 men who were prisoners of a war they'd lost, in a ship they hadn't chosen, in an ocean they'd never seen before. To me, the most telling detail in this entire chapter isn't the torpedo hit, or the rescue, or the shark accounts. It's that figure, 4,230 meters. Below the reach of any archaeology, any repatriation, any flag-draped ceremony. The sea is their record, and their grave, and their only monument. The accounts of the survivors who reached the surface describe, almost universally, the transition from the internal chaos of the sinking ship to the strange and terrible calm of the open water at night. The fires, the noise, the crushing presence of hundreds of panicking people, all of that replaced, suddenly, by the open South Atlantic sky and the sound of calling voices scattered across dark water. Frank Holding, a British merchant seaman who had already survived the sinking of the SS Beatus 2 years earlier, was on deck when the ship was struck, and his account describes hearing the Italian prisoners below decks, the sound carrying up through the hull. Panicking, crying, he said, in the account preserved in the secondary sources. It's a terrible thing, men crying. He made it to a lifeboat. Of the nearly 1,800 men below him, fewer than 500 did. The arithmetic of that disproportion is the core moral fact of the Laconia sinking, and it precedes every decision that followed: the rescue, the bombing, the order, by 60 minutes of darkness and noise that most of the historical record has chosen, quietly and consistently, not to linger on. Hartenstein's decision, the radio in the dark. At some point between 2300 hours on the 12th of September and 1:25 in the morning on the 13th, Korvettenkapitän Werner Hartenstein made a series of decisions that had no precedent in his training, his operational orders, or the standing doctrine of the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm. He didn't make them all at once. That's the important thing to understand. This wasn't a single heroic moment of clarity. It was a ratchet, a series of incrementally escalating commitments, each one making the next harder to abandon, driven by what he was discovering in the water around his submarine as the Laconia settled and sank. The U-156's war diary for that period has a notable gap. After logging the torpedo attacks, there is no entry for the roughly 78 minutes between the sinking and Hartenstein's first radio signal to headquarters. He wasn't writing. He was on deck, and what he was seeing and hearing was changing what he did next. The first thing he heard, in the water around his surfaced submarine, was Italian. That needs a moment of explanation, because the operational implications were immediate and significant. Germany and Italy were Allied powers, the Axis, and had been since Italy's declaration of war in June 1940. Italian military personnel, under the conventions of the era and the explicit terms of the Axis alliance, were not enemies of Germany. They were allies. Finding that a significant proportion of the people dying in the water around you are the soldiers of an allied nation is not a straightforward tactical situation. It's a political and moral complication of the first order, arriving without warning at approximately 11:30 at night in the middle of the South Atlantic. Hartenstein had sunk a British troopship carrying Allied Italian prisoners. He hadn't known. The operational intelligence on the Laconia's manifest was apparently not available to him before the attack. This is confirmed by the text of his first signal to headquarters, in which he describes the discovery as new information, not something he'd factored into his firing solution. But here's the thing. The Italian factor explains why Hartenstein started the rescue. It doesn't fully explain why he sustained it at the scale he did. By the time U-156 broadcast her open, uncoded English-language message to all shipping in the area at 6 o'clock in the morning of the 13th of September, Hartenstein had approximately 193 survivors aboard a submarine designed for between 48 and 56 men, with 4 lifeboats in tow containing approximately another 200 people. Those in tow weren't all Italian. Many were British. The British survivors who came aboard U-156 described, in their accounts, treatment that goes well beyond the minimum obligations of alliance politics. Doris Hawkins, the missionary nurse who survived 27 days in a lifeboat and published her account in 1943 under the title Atlantic Torpedo, described Hartenstein as particularly charming and helpful. He could scarcely have done more if he was entertaining us in peacetime. Frank Holding described being offered a fistful of cigarettes after his hands were dressed. The operational record and the survivor testimony describe a man who was doing more, and doing it with more evident personal engagement than the Italian alliance obligation alone required. Hartenstein's coded signal to Donitz at 1:25 in the morning was militarily efficient and personally revealing in equal measure. The message, as transcribed in the BDU War Diary and reproduced in the historical literature, reported the sinking, the grid position, the fuel state, the torpedo inventory, all standard operational data, and then added, unfortunately, with 1,500 Italian POWs, 90 fished out so far, request orders. The word lighter, unfortunately, is not standard naval signal language. It's an admission. It acknowledges that something unintended has happened, and it frames the rescue already underway not as a strategic calculation, but as a response to a situation that shouldn't have occurred. What makes this signal remarkable as a document is not what it says, but what it implies. Hartenstein was already rescuing people when he sent it. He had 90 survivors aboard before he'd received any orders to rescue anyone. He was reporting a fait accompli and asking for guidance on how to continue. The second signal, the uncoded English-language broadcast sent at 6 in the morning on the 25-meter shortwave band, is a different order of document entirely. If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Laconia crew, I will not attack her provided I am not attacked by ship or air forces. I picked up 193 men, 4 degrees 53 minutes south, 11 degrees 26 minutes west, German submarine. That message, broadcast on the International Maritime Communication Frequency to the maximum possible audience, was a declaration of a temporary ceasefire and a request for multinational rescue assistance, issued without authorization from headquarters. It gave U-156's precise position to enemy navies. It promised non-aggression to any ship approaching. It was, in any technical sense, improvised diplomacy conducted by a submarine commander with no diplomatic training and no mandate to negotiate anything. The British signal station at Freetown intercepted this message. They logged it. They did not send ships to assist because they feared it was a trap. That decision, to disbelieve a genuine plea for help because the rules of war had conditioned everyone to assume deception, is one of the more painful institutional failures in this story, and it runs beneath everything that followed. By the morning of the 15th of September, the situation on and around U-156 had reached a level of logistical complexity that was genuinely extraordinary. The submarine had approximately 200 people crowded above and below decks, a figure that represents roughly 4 times her designed crew capacity, and had 4 lifeboats in tow containing a further 200. The physical conditions aboard must have been extreme. The internal CO2 levels in a sealed submarine with 4 times the normal human population would have risen measurably within hours, creating an atmosphere that was both psychologically and physiologically taxing for crew and survivors alike. There was no proper food for that many people. There was limited fresh water. The medical facilities aboard a Type 9C U-boat amounted to a first aid kit and whatever the crew's Oberbootsman could manage. And yet, the rescue continued. By mid-morning on the 15th, U-506, under Kapitän Lieutenant Erich Verdeman, had arrived and joined the operation, followed hours later by U-507, under Korvettenkapitän Harro Schacht, and the Italian submarine Comandante Capellini, under Lieutenant Commander Marco Revedin. 4 submarines, hundreds of miles from any friendly port, with survivors standing on their casings in the tropical sun, and more lifeboats strung out behind them on improvised tow lines. One detail that I keep returning to from this phase of the rescue, and it's the kind of detail that doesn't appear in the strategic summaries, but matters enormously for understanding what kind of operation this actually was, is Schacht's behavior aboard U-507. Janet Walker, a British civilian passenger who had lost her young daughter Doreen in the chaos of the initial sinking, was among the survivors Schacht's submarine picked up. According to the accounts preserved in the secondary literature, Schacht allowed Walker to come to the conning tower of his submarine repeatedly to scan the horizon with his own binoculars, looking for her missing child. He specifically went out of his way to investigate nearby lifeboats in the hope of finding the girl. The child was not found, and we'll come back to Janet Walker's story in a later chapter, because it doesn't end there, and it doesn't end cleanly. But the image of a Kriegsmarine submarine commander lending his binoculars to a British woman looking for her daughter across a rescue field in the South Atlantic is not an image that fits any simple moral category of this war. It's just a human act in the middle of everything else. The uncoded broadcast was Hartenstein's most consequential single decision, and not for the reason most people assume. It wasn't primarily important because of who responded to it. The British didn't send ships, and the Vichy French were contacted through different channels. It was important because it established, in a documented and transmissible form, that a German submarine was conducting a rescue operation under a self-declared ceasefire at a precise location with precise coordinates, broadcasting on an open frequency. That broadcast was the legal and moral foundation for everything that followed. When an American aircraft arrived at that location 2 days later and was given that information, by Hartenstein's own signal, by a British officer's voice transmission, by the visual evidence of a Red Cross flag laid across the submarine's gun deck, the question of what the pilot and his commanding officer knew, and when they knew it, becomes legally precise. You can't claim you didn't know about the rescue if the rescue broadcast its position and its intentions on an open frequency 2 days earlier. The Americans had the information. What they did with it is the subject of the next chapter. The logistics of mercy: 4 submarines and 400 people. On the morning of the 15th of September, 1942, something was happening in the South Atlantic that had no operational precedent in the history of submarine warfare. 4 submarines, 2 German, 1 Italian, with a 4th German boat managing the original survivor load, were proceeding in loose formation toward the African coastline, their hulls loaded with people, lifeboats strung behind them on improvised tow lines, in conditions that no naval architect had ever designed for and no operational manual had ever anticipated. The combined submerged displacement of those 4 submarines was approximately 5,200 tons. They were carrying, between them and the boats they towed, the better part of 800 survivors. This is not a metaphor. This is a logistics problem, and it was being managed in real time by 4 submarine commanders with no common chain of command, communicating through a partially compromised radio link, taking orders from multiple sources. Donitz's headquarters, the Italian Navy Command. And in Hartenstein's case, directly from his own evolving assessment of the situation. The operational coordination was managed primarily through the BDU, Donitz's headquarters, which was, during this period, receiving signals from the submarines, relaying instructions from Berlin, negotiating with the Vichy French through diplomatic channels, and simultaneously managing the ongoing Battle of the Atlantic across the rest of the North and South Atlantic operating areas. The War Diary entries for mid-September 1942 show a headquarters staff dealing with a crisis that had erupted across their operational map at the worst possible moment. The Ice Bear boats had been released for Cape Town, but their radio silence was broken. The Italian Navy had involved itself through the Capellini deployment, and Hitler's order to abandon the rescue had been partially overridden by Raeder in a command negotiation that the War Diary records with careful diplomatic understatement. When I was reading through Clay Blair's reconstruction of this period, what struck me most was the degree to which Donitz's headquarters was improvising, managing a humanitarian crisis with the administrative tools of a submarine warfare command, and finding that those tools were not well suited to the task. The Vichy French warships are the element of this story that English-language histories consistently underweight, and I want to spend some time on them here because their role in the actual rescue, in terms of the number of people they eventually recovered, was, by the final accounting, larger than that of the submarines. Donitz passed the request for French surface vessels through Raeder's office, which used German Vichy diplomatic channels, not military channels, to approach the Vichy French Navy. The response was swift and substantial. The 7,600-ton cruiser Gloire was dispatched from Dakar, and 2 sloops, the 660-ton Annamite and the 2,000-ton Dumont d'Urville, were sent from Conakry in French Guinea and Cotonou in Dahomey, respectively. The combined displacement of the French relief force was approximately 10,260 tons, nearly twice the combined displacement of all 4 submarines. These were serious warships, with proper medical facilities, crew quarters, and the capacity to take on large numbers of survivors in conditions that were actually survivable over a multi-day transit. The political context of the Vichy French involvement is one that I think deserves more attention than it usually receives in accounts focused on the Hartenstein rescue narrative. The Gloire and her companions were ships of a collaborationist government, a French administration that had signed an armistice with Germany in June 1940 and was, by the time of the Laconia rescue, operating its surviving naval forces under conditions of complex and often degrading political constraint. The Gloire specifically had been damaged at Mers el-Kebir in July 1940, when the British Royal Navy attacked the French fleet to prevent it from falling into German hands, an action that killed approximately 1,297 French sailors. The officers commanding the French rescue vessels in September 1942 were serving a government that the British had bombed 2 years earlier, and they were now sailing to rescue British survivors of a German attack. The layers of political history embedded in that mission are almost impossible to adequately convey in a narrative format. The men on Gloire's bridge had lost colleagues at Mers el-Kebir, and they went anyway. The submarine's towing operations deserve a technical note, because they were genuinely improvised, and the improvisation is an important part of understanding what this rescue actually involved at the mechanical level. Standard Type 9C submarines carried mooring equipment, bollards, cleats, and anchor chain, but nothing designed for towing multiple occupied lifeboats at sea-keeping speed across hundreds of miles of open ocean. Hartenstein's crew rigged their tow lines using whatever was available, mooring lines, anchor chain run through hull fittings not designed for sustained towing load. The dynamics of towing an occupied wooden lifeboat, approximately 7 to 8 meters in length, built to Whelan-Davit specifications, laden with 60 to 100 exhausted people, from a submarine moving at 4 to 6 knots through Atlantic swells is a genuine engineering challenge. The tension on the tow line varies with every wave cycle. At the wrong angle, in the wrong sea state, the line can part or the lifeboat can broach. That Hartenstein maintained 4 lifeboats in tow for more than 48 hours is an achievement that the historical narratives mention in passing but never properly credit. Verdemann's U-506 and Schacht's U-507 each took on substantial survivor loads after their arrival on the 15th. The figures that come down through the primary sources are striking. Schacht's boat eventually had 491 survivors aboard, of whom 15 were women and 16 were children. Verdemann's boat had 151, including 9 women and children. These are people sleeping on torpedo storage racks. They are people sharing the single toilet arrangements of a submarine designed for 50 men. They are people breathing recycled air in a pressure hull 73.5 meters long with no portholes, no natural light, and no way to step outside. The Type 9C's internal volume is tight even for its designed crew. With 3 to 4 times that number of humans inside, the atmosphere, literally and figuratively, would have been close to intolerable within 12 hours. And yet, survivors' accounts describe almost universally treatment by the submarine crews that was correct, sometimes generous, and occasionally actively kind. The Italian submarine Comandante Capellini under Riveden had a different operational experience than the German boats. After taking on her survivor load, Riveden was unable to locate the Vichy French vessels at the planned rendezvous point and spent an extended period at sea awaiting instructions from his own naval command. The communication chain ran: Riveden to Italian Naval Command, to Axis Liaison, to Vichy French, a relay that was slow, imprecise, and periodically incoherent. He maintained his survivors aboard through this period without any clear indication of when relief would come. When the Dumont d'Urville finally located him on the 20th of September, the transfer was conducted and the survivors were passed across. What happened after the transfer is one of the more extraordinary documents produced by the entire incident. When the British and Polish survivors reached Casablanca, Colonel Baldwin, representing the British military personnel among the rescued, presented the captain of the Capellini with a formal letter of gratitude, signed on behalf of all the British, Polish, and civilian survivors. The letter, quoted in Léonce Payard's 1963 account, reads, "We, the undersigned officers of His Majesty's Navy, Army, and Air Force, and of the Merchant Navy, wish to express to you our deepest and sincerest gratitude for all you have done, at the cost of very great difficulties for your ship and her crew, in welcoming us, the survivors of His Majesty's transport ship, the Laconia." A formal British military letter of thanks to an Italian submarine commander. Signed, delivered, preserved. There is no diplomatic framework that can adequately contain that document. It exists anyway. The final accounting of the rescue, which came only when the Vichy ships had completed their transit to Dakar and Casablanca, an account was taken, was both a record of significant achievement and a record of catastrophic failure simultaneously. 373 Italians rescued, 70 Poles, 597 British, including 48 women and children. A total of 1,083 people eventually confirmed as rescued, out of an original manifest of 2,732. 1,658 to 1,757 dead, depending on which end of the source range you accept. The rescue operation, which had involved 4 submarines, 3 Vichy warships, and more than a week of continuous effort across hundreds of miles of ocean, had saved just under 40% of the people who had been aboard the Laconia on the night of the 12th of September. The other 60% were at the bottom of the Atlantic, or were still dying in lifeboats that hadn't been found yet. And the reason the final tally wasn't higher, the reason that an operation that was, by any measure, achieving something, was violently interrupted at its most productive moment, is the subject of the next chapter. The secret airfield and the order to sink. Ascension Island is a volcanic speck of rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, roughly 800 miles from the African coast and an equal distance from the coast of South America. In 1942, it was officially classified. If you ask the right people in Washington or London, it didn't operationally exist. In practice, it was home to a United States Army Air Forces base that had been operational since mid-1942, running long-range patrol missions across the South Atlantic shipping lanes, searching for submarines primarily in the corridor between Brazil and West Africa, through which enormous quantities of Allied shipping moved every day. The base's fuel and maintenance facilities were built to support extended patrol operations, and its location, theoretically equidistant from both American and African shores, made it an ideal staging point for the kind of long-duration anti-submarine missions that the B-24 Liberator bomber was designed to execute. The base was operationally critical. Its secrecy was, in the summer of 1942, considered genuinely important. And on the morning of the 16th of September, one of its B-24 crews, on their very first operational mission, flew over a stretch of South Atlantic Ocean and saw something that nobody at that base had ever briefed them to expect. Lieutenant James D. Hardin and his crew had been airborne for several hours when they spotted U-156 on the surface at approximately 11:25 in the morning. The submarine was traveling with survivors on her decks and with lifeboats in tow behind her. Draped across her gun deck was a large Red Cross flag, approximately 4 meters square by Hartenstein's own description in his war diary account. Hardin didn't attack immediately. That's worth noting because it suggests his crew understood that something unusual was happening and needed clarification. He turned away from the submarine and radioed his base on Ascension Island to report what he'd seen and request instructions. He described the position, the survivors visible on the deck, the lifeboats in tow, and the Red Cross flag. The reply from Ascension Island was swift. It was 2 words: sink sub. The officer who gave that order was Captain Robert C. Richardson III, the senior officer on duty at Ascension that day. Richardson was not a reckless officer, and it would be both historically inaccurate and intellectually lazy to frame his decision as simple callousness. What Richardson had at the moment he gave the order was a deeply incomplete and systematically garbled picture of the situation he was responding to. The British signal station at Freetown had passed a message to Ascension on the 15th of September about the Laconia sinking, but the message was, in Clay Blair's sourced assessment, poorly composed. It implied the ship had only just been sunk, made no mention of the German rescue operation that had been ongoing for 3 days, and made no reference to Hartenstein's open-frequency broadcast of the 13th or the Vichy French vessels that were already en route. Richardson, in other words, received a message that told him a British ship had been sunk, and that gave him no information that would allow him to distinguish a submarine conducting a rescue from a submarine that had just finished attacking. Richardson later articulated 5 specific reasons for giving the attack order, as documented in the 1964 article by U.S. Air Force historians Maurer and Pazek in the Royal United Services Institute Journal. The first public disclosure of Richardson's role, published 22 years after the event and in a British military journal rather than an American one. His 5 reasons were that he believed international law did not permit a combat vessel to fly Red Cross flags, that he believed the submarine was rescuing only Italian POWs, not Allied personnel, that he feared the submarine would subsequently attack 2 Allied freighters he knew were in the area, that he feared the submarine's crew would discover and report the location of the secret Ascension airbase and fuel facilities, and that he believed his rules of engagement required him to prosecute the attack when a submarine was identified. Each of these reasons is factually testable against what was actually happening, and each of them is, to a significant degree, wrong. The Red Cross provision was legally incorrect. The 1929 Geneva Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of Wounded, Sick, and Shipwrecked Members of Armed Forces at Sea, which the United States had ratified, did not prohibit a warship from displaying Red Cross markings during genuine rescue operations. The submarine was not rescuing only Italians. It had British, Polish, and civilian survivors aboard. The Allied freighters were not attacked. the airbase was not subsequently shelled by U-156. Richardson's tactical threat assessment was wrong on every specific point. But here is the thing that the binary framing of war crime versus fog of war consistently misses. Richardson's error was procedurally rational given his information state. He had a submarine in his patrol area. He had the authority and the obligation to prosecute submarine contacts. He had received a message about a British ship being sunk, and he had no information, none, because the message from Freetown had not provided it, about the rescue operation that had been ongoing for 72 hours. The massacre that followed was not the product of malice. It was the product of an information system that had failed at a specific node, the Freetown signal station, in a way that stripped the humanitarian context out of the message before it reached the officer with the authority to act on it. Good military procedure applied to catastrophically incomplete information. The result was identical to the result of deliberate violence. The Naval Warfare Conventions made no distinction between the two. Hardin flew back to the scene at 12:32 in the afternoon. His initial 3 bomb release attempts failed, a technical failure consistent with the known difficulties of adapting the Liberator's high-altitude bombing systems for low-level anti-submarine attacks, a problem documented across multiple B-24 crews in anti-submarine operations during this period. On his 4th pass, he successfully released 2 bombs. One landed among the lifeboats that U-156 had in tow, killing dozens of the survivors that Hartenstein had spent 3 days pulling from the water. The other straddled the submarine itself, causing damage to the control room and bow compartment that was severe enough to flood those sections partially. Hartenstein ordered the survivors on his deck to put on life jackets and enter the water, then put U-156 into a steep dive, giving those still on the casing a few moments to get clear. The lifeboats that had been cut adrift, the ones that had survived the bomb strike, were now loose in the ocean with their occupants, no tow line, no submarine, and a significant distance from the nearest land. Hardin's after-action report stated that the submarine had been sunk. The sub rolled over and was last seen bottom up, the report read, as subsequently cited in the historical literature. Crew had abandoned sub and taken to surrounding lifeboats. This was not accurate. U-156 had dived and survived. What had been sunk were 2 lifeboats. The crew of the Liberator were subsequently awarded medals for the alleged sinking of U-156. The medals were not revoked when it became clear that the submarine hadn't been sunk. The incident was classified. It would remain classified, in its essential details, for 22 years. The survivors from the destroyed lifeboats, people who had already survived the sinking of the Laconia, survived the initial hours in the water, been rescued by Hartenstein's crew, and spent 3 days aboard or in tow behind U-156, were now in the ocean again, without submarine support, with their rescuer forced to abandon them. Some of them got into the undamaged lifeboats that Hartenstein had cut free before diving. Some of them didn't. Donitz, when he received news of the attack that evening, was, by his own description in his memoirs, furious. His immediate signal to the remaining submarines ordered them to prioritize their own safety above the rescue. But then, after what he described in his memoirs as a very heated discussion with senior staff, he changed course. He ordered U-506 and U-507 to hold position until the Vichy French vessels arrived. This decision, to maintain the rescue against the explicit tactical logic of the B-24 attack, resulted in a second American attack on the 17th of September, this time targeting U-506, which had 151 survivors aboard, including 9 women and children. The bomb release failed on the first pass. On the second pass, 2 500-pound bombs and 2 350-pound depth charges were dropped, but caused no damage. U-506 crash-dived and survived. The French vessels arrived later that day. The transfer of survivors to the Gloire and the Annamite proceeded, and the rescue, what was left of it, was completed. The cover-up that followed the American attacks was not, as far as the documentary record shows, a coordinated conspiracy. It was something more diffuse and in some ways more troubling. The aggregate effect of multiple command levels choosing, independently, not to raise a question that was politically and diplomatically uncomfortable. Washington and London both had reasons to prefer that the story of the Laconia not become a story about Allied aircraft killing Allied rescued survivors. The Laconia Order, which Dönitz issued on the 17th of September, the same day as the second American attack, gave the German Navy a clear story to tell about the incident, that they had tried to rescue and been bombed. The Allied narrative required the suppression of exactly that story, and so, for 22 years, the precise details of Richardson's decision and Hardin's attack were classified, unavailable to the public, unacknowledged in any official Allied account of the Battle of the Atlantic. The families of the people killed in those lifeboats on the 16th of September, 1942, killed by Allied bombs while under the protection of a Red Cross flag, 3 days after being rescued from the ocean, were not told what had happened. The Naval War College's International Law Studies series would later describe the situation in language that is worth quoting directly. The person who issued the order to attack and the aircraft commander who carried it out are both prima facie guilty of a war crime. That assessment is not German propaganda. It is the published conclusion of American naval legal scholars. What the water held: sharks, oil, and 27 days in Lifeboat 9. After Hartenstein cut the tow lines and crash dived on the afternoon of the 16th of September 1942, the lifeboats that had been in his care were alone on the open ocean. Some of them were picked up by U-506 and U-507, which were still on the surface and still conducting the rescue. Some of them were found by the Vichy French vessels when they arrived the following day. And some of them, the ones that had been cast furthest adrift, or whose occupants hadn't heard Hartenstein's repeated advice to stay in position and wait, began the long, bad journey toward the African coast on their own. The ocean distance from grid square FF7721 to the nearest point of the African shore is approximately 600 miles. A standard Welland-type lifeboat of the era, 7 to 8 meters in length, with 5 oars but no sail and no rudder, moving through South Atlantic swells in September, could cover, in favorable conditions, perhaps 15 to 20 miles a day. The people in those boats were doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was not good. Lifeboat 9 began her independent journey with approximately 69 people aboard. The boat was Welland-type, designed to a maximum capacity of roughly 55 persons, which means it was already 25% over capacity at the moment it was cut loose. And that condition, the initial overcrowding, is not a detail but a structural cause of what followed. The waterline was lower than designed. The hull flexed differently under load. The bailing requirement was constant and relentless. Among those 69 people was Doris Hawkins, a missionary nurse who had been returning to Britain after 5 years of service in Palestine. Hawkins had, in the initial chaos of the sinking, been carrying a 14-month-old child named Sally K. Redman, the infant daughter of another passenger who had entrusted the baby to her care. In the frantic confusion of the lifeboat launching, in the capsizing and righting and overcrowding of those first minutes, Hawkins lost the child. "I lost her," she wrote later in her 1943 pamphlet Atlantic Torpedo, published by Victor Gollancz in London. "I did not hear her cry even then, and I am sure that God took her immediately to himself without suffering. I never saw her again." The Commonwealth War Graves Commission records Sally K. Redman as a casualty of the Laconia sinking. She was 14 months old. The provisions in Lifeboat 9, as recorded in Hawkins' account, were 15 gallons of water, ship's biscuits, high-calorie Horlicks tablets, chocolate, and bars of pemmican. 15 gallons of water, 69 people. The United States Navy's Survival Manual, working from physiological data on minimum hydration requirements in tropical conditions, calculates the absolute minimum water intake necessary for survival at approximately 1 liter per person per day, and that figure assumes minimal activity, shade, and the absence of extreme heat stress, none of which applied to people in an open lifeboat in the equatorial South Atlantic in September. 15 gallons is approximately 57 liters. By the minimum survival calculation, that is enough water for approximately 1 person for the entire 27-day journey. For 69 people, It was enough for less than a single day at minimum ration. The only way it lasted was through extreme rationing, fractions of a cup per person per day, and through the steady attrition of the population that was consuming it. Every person who died gave their share back to the ones still alive. What the 27 days in Lifeboat 9 actually looked like, the texture of the experience, as distinct from the statistics, is preserved primarily in Hawkins' pamphlet, which runs to 48 pages and is the most direct primary source account of the survival experience that I've found in any English-language material on this incident. Her prose is not florid. It doesn't reach for dramatic effect. It reports. Daily we saw our companions growing weaker, saw they had not long to live, and then sometimes found they were no longer with us, she wrote. Some, despite all warnings, drank salt water and succumbed, and others became delirious. Their cries and rambling speech and often repeated pleas for water were terrible to hear. The delirium of saltwater ingestion, a syndrome produced by the cascading effects of hypernatremia, where excess sodium drives water out of brain cells and produces confusion, agitation, seizures, and eventually coma, was visible, progressive, and audible in an open boat that offered no privacy and no distance from the dying. The people in Lifeboat 9 watched it happen. They couldn't prevent it, and they couldn't escape from it. Multiple rogue waves hit the boat during the 27 days. The South Atlantic is not a gentle ocean in any season, and the swells that September are capable of producing waves that can swamp or capsize even a properly loaded lifeboat. Each capsize or near capsize resulted in people going into the water. Some came back. Some were too exhausted to come back. Hawkins herself was capsized multiple times during the early days. She had originally been rescued from the open water around the Laconia by Hartenstein's crew, transferred to the lifeboat while U-156 was still supporting the rescue, and then cast adrift again after the B-24 attack. She describes, in the pamphlet, being hauled back into the boat by companions after one such capsize, her back injured from the force of the ship's boiler explosion during the original sinking, her legs so sunburned and swollen that she could barely stand. She kept a record. She noted who died and, where she could, what they had asked her to carry back to the people who loved them. By day 27, she had accumulated a significant collection of letters, photographs, and personal objects from people who knew they were dying and wanted something of themselves to reach home. On roughly the 27th day, Hawkins' account, with the imprecision of extreme physical deprivation, doesn't give a clean day count for the final approach. A member of the Laconia's crew in the boat spotted what appeared to be ships on the horizon, shapes that seemed to be moving. Then, gradually, shapes that weren't moving at all, ships at anchor. The coast of Liberia was ahead of them. Our prayers were answered, Hawkins wrote. 16 of the 69 people who had entered Lifeboat 9 were alive. The other 53 were somewhere behind them in the Atlantic, over the side at night, slipped away in the early mornings, gone from the boat in ones and twos over the course of nearly 4 weeks. Survival had nothing to do with will or courage or the particular qualities of individuals. It was arithmetic and geography. 16 people were alive because the boat had drifted into a shipping lane, and because 16 happened to be the number left when the coast appeared. The second lifeboat to attempt the Africa Passage, the one that began with 68 people aboard, reached the coast after 27 days with 16 survivors. The third, which had 52 people when it was cast adrift, was found by a British trawler after 40 days at sea. 4 people were alive. Those figures, 16 from 69, 16 from 68, 4 from 52, are the statistical record of what happens when human beings attempt to cross 600 miles of open ocean in an overcrowded, under-provisioned lifeboat without mechanical assistance. The survival rates are not random in the mathematical sense. They correlate with boat condition, initial provisions, the specific trajectory of each boat relative to shipping lanes, and the timing of bad weather. But from inside the boat, they were random in every experiential sense. Nobody in Lifeboat 9 knew on day 1 who the 16 would be. That uncertainty, that complete absence of any rational basis for predicting your own survival, is the experience that the strategic accounts of the Laconia incident consistently skip over. The submarines and the diplomacy and the legal aftermath are interesting, but the 27 days in Lifeboat 9 is where most of the dying actually happened. After reaching Liberia and eventual rescue, Doris Hawkins returned to Britain. And then she did something that receives one paragraph at most in the secondary literature on the Laconia, and that I think deserves considerably more attention. She spent the years following the war visiting, personally, the families of every person who had died in Lifeboat 9, returning the objects and letters and photographs that the dying had pressed into her hands in their final days, delivering the last messages that people had asked her to carry. She had made promises at sea. She kept them on land. House by house, family by family, for years. The pamphlet she published in 1943 closes with a passage that has stayed with me since I first read it. It is impossible to imagine why I should have been chosen to survive when so many did not. I have been reluctant to write the story of our experiences, but in answer to many requests, I have done so. And if it strengthens someone's faith, if it is an inspiration to any, if it brings home to others, hitherto untouched, all that those who go down to the sea in ships face for our sakes, hour by hour, day by day, year in and year out, it will not have been written in vain. That sentence is not military history. It isn't strategic analysis. It's the voice of a woman who survived something most people couldn't imagine, and who chose to spend her post-war years honoring the specific, individual dead rather than the aggregate casualty figure. The historical record of the Laconia incident contains a great deal of discussion about Hartenstein's moral choices, about Donitz's command decisions, about Richardson's tactical assessment, about the legal implications of the Laconia order. It contains very little discussion of Doris Hawkins going door to door after the war. I think that's the wrong proportion. The Italian equation: alliance politics disguised as compassion. There's a version of the Laconia rescue story that presents itself as a straightforward moral fable. A German submarine commander discovered he'd accidentally killed his own allies and, driven by conscience, spent 3 days pulling people out of the sea. That version isn't wrong exactly, but it's incomplete in a way that matters, because it strips out the political architecture that made the rescue possible in the first place. And that architecture tells you something much more uncomfortable about how decisions get made in wartime. The Italian dimension of the rescue wasn't incidental. In September 1942, with the Axis war effort under pressure on multiple fronts and the relationship between Berlin and Rome increasingly strained, the discovery that a German U-boat had killed approximately 1,400 Italian soldiers wasn't just a humanitarian problem. It was a diplomatic emergency. To understand why Donitz moved as quickly as he did after receiving Hartenstein's signal, you need to understand the strategic condition of the Axis alliance in that specific month. By September 1942, Italy's military position in North Africa was in serious trouble. Field Marshal Rommel's supply lines were stretched and contested. The Italian armed forces had suffered enormous casualties at Gazala and in the retreat to El Alamein. Italian public opinion, never enthusiastically supportive of a war that seemed to deliver suffering without corresponding victories, was increasingly fragile. The relationship between the German and Italian commands was tense at the operational level, with Italian officers frequently complaining that German strategic priorities consistently overrode Italian interests. Into this context, a report arrives at BDU headquarters that 1,500 Italian prisoners of war, soldiers who had been captured serving under the Axis banner, are dying in the South Atlantic because a German submarine fired torpedoes into the ship carrying them. The political implications of doing nothing are significant. Donitz understood that immediately. His first response, moving to divert the ice bar boats from the Cape Town mission, was rapid precisely because the Italian alliance calculus demanded speed. What makes the archival record of the next 24 hours so revealing is the chain of authority it exposes. Donitz moved first. Hitler was briefed and ordered the rescue abandoned. The Cape Town operation was too valuable. Then Raider intervened, releasing the ice bar boats for Cape Town, but keeping two additional submarines, U-506 and U-507, on the rescue. The Italian submarine Comandante Capellini was separately dispatched, apparently on Italian Navy initiative or in response to direct Italian diplomatic pressure. Three overlapping command authorities issued three partially contradictory orders about the same submarines within a 12-hour window. None of those orders was purely humanitarian. Each one reflected a specific institutional interest: Donitz's interest in managing his alliance obligations, Hitler's interest in not compromising the Cape Town strategic objective, and the Italian Navy's interest in ensuring that Italian personnel were being actively recovered by Italian as well as German assets. The rescue was real. The human effort that went into it was genuine, but the decision to conduct it was political from the first signal. The most significant command decision of the entire rescue period, and the one that most English-language histories mention in a single sentence and then move past, was Donitz's order, issued after the B-24 attack, to offload all British and Polish survivors into lifeboats and continue the rescue operation only for Italian personnel. This order is documented in the contemporaneous record. It was transmitted in writing to the submarines at sea, and it was, by any reasonable moral standard, an instruction to abandon several hundred people in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean because of their nationality. The fact that Schacht aboard U-507 and Verdeman aboard U-506 both chose not to obey this order, keeping all survivors aboard regardless of nationality, is the most important act of individual moral judgment in the entire incident, and it has received almost no attention in the historical literature. These were junior officers disobeying a written order from their commanding admiral in wartime. They could have been court-martialed. They were not. Donitz, whose memoirs are otherwise reasonably candid about this period, does not mention the disobedience at all. It's as if it didn't happen. But it did, and the survivors are alive because it did. It fascinates me, working through the secondary literature on this, how consistently the political motivation for the rescue is softened in the English-language accounts in favor of a cleaner humanitarian narrative. Clay Blair's 1998 study of the U-boat war is relatively candid about it. He notes explicitly that Hartenstein may have been concerned about the effect his action would have on German relations with Italy, as well as having possible humanitarian considerations. The Wikipedia article on the incident acknowledges it briefly, but the popular history version of the Laconia story, including most documentary treatments, tends to present Hartenstein's rescue as a spontaneous act of human decency, full stop. That framing isn't dishonest, but it omits the structural fact that Donitz's headquarters made the decision to sustain and expand the rescue only after receiving information that Italian alliance personnel were involved. Without the Italian factor, the rescue might have been a smaller, shorter, and less diplomatically supported operation. That's not a cynical reading of the evidence, it's what the evidence says. The final survivor accounting, taken when the Vichy French ships reached Dakar and Casablanca, makes the Italian alliance motivation look, at minimum, inadequate to its stated purpose. 373 Italians were rescued, 70 Poles were rescued, 597 British were rescued, including 48 women and children. The Italian survivor count represents approximately 21% of the 1,793 Italians who had boarded the ship at Cape Town. Despite the entire rescue operation being politically motivated, at least in part, by the imperative to recover Italian Allied soldiers, the Italian prisoners had the worst survival rate of any group aboard. They died disproportionately because they were locked in the lower holds when the torpedoes struck, and because the structural conditions of the ship's conversion had placed them in the most vulnerable position. The political motivation to rescue them couldn't undo the architectural conditions that had already killed them. The alliance politics that started the rescue were real. Their inadequacy to the actual scale of Italian suffering is also real. Both things sit in the same accounting, and the ledger doesn't balance. There is one document from this period that cuts through all the political complexity and says something more direct than any command signal or war diary entry. When the British and Polish survivors aboard the Italian submarine Comandante Cappellini were eventually transferred to the Vichy French vessel Dumont d'Urville and reached Casablanca, Colonel Baldwin, signing on behalf of all the British military officers, RAF personnel, Royal Navy officers, Merchant Navy seamen, and Polish soldiers who had been aboard the Cappellini, presented a formal written letter of gratitude to the Italian submarine's captain. The letter, preserved in Léonce Payard's account of the incident, reads in part, "We wish to express to you our deepest and sincerest gratitude for all you have done, at the cost of very great difficulties for your ship and her crew, in welcoming us, the survivors of His Majesty's transport ship, the Laconia." A British Army colonel, on behalf of Allied military personnel from multiple services and 2 nations, writing a formal letter of thanks to the commander of an Axis submarine. No diplomatic framework created that document. No alliance calculation required it. It exists because the men on both sides recognized that something human had happened between them, and they chose to say so in writing. You can explain the Italian alliance motivation for the rescue from top to bottom, through every layer of political calculation, and the Baldwin letter still sits at the end of it, refusing to be explained by any of that. The Vichy paradox. Rescuers without a country. On the morning of the 17th of September 1942, the French cruiser Gloire was moving at speed through the South Atlantic toward a set of coordinates that had been transmitted to her through a chain of communication that ran from a German U-boat, through BDU headquarters at Lorient, through German Vichy diplomatic channels, to Vichy French Naval Command at Dakar. She was steaming to collect the survivors of a British ship sunk by a German submarine, at the request of Germany's Naval Command, in service of an Axis alliance she was politically required to support. The sailors aboard the Gloire were French. The state they served was French only in the most technical and contested sense. It was a collaborationist government operating under German political supervision from the city of Vichy, with limited sovereignty and a deeply compromised moral authority. And some of those sailors almost certainly remembered, or had known men who died in, what had happened to French warships at Mers el-Kebir in July 1940, when the Royal Navy had attacked the French fleet and killed approximately 1,297 French sailors in a single afternoon. Now they were going to rescue British survivors. The layers of history compressed into that voyage are almost impossible to fully articulate. The British attack at Mers el-Kebir is not a well-known episode outside specialist naval history circles, but it's essential context for understanding what the Vichy French rescue mission in September 1942 actually meant to the men conducting it. In early July 1940, following the fall of France and the French armistice with Germany, the British government faced a strategic crisis. The French Navy, the 4th largest fleet in the world at the time, was suddenly in ambiguous political territory. If those ships fell under German operational control, the Royal Navy's superiority in the Atlantic could be compromised. Churchill authorized Operation Catapult, which included an ultimatum to the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in Algeria. When the French commanders refused the British terms, which they considered humiliating and operationally unacceptable, the Royal Navy opened fire. The Britannia was sunk with the loss of nearly 1,000 men. The Dunkirk and Provence were heavily damaged. 1,297 French sailors were killed in an action that France experienced as a straightforward betrayal by an ally. It created a bitterness in the French naval officer corps that ran very deep. The Gloire, a La Galissonière-class light cruiser of 7,600 tons capable of 31 knots, had been caught in the engagement and sustained damage before reaching Casablanca. She was now, 2 years later, heading at speed to rescue British soldiers. When I try to put myself in the position of the Gloire's commanding officer in that moment, and the name of that officer is not preserved in the English language sources I've worked with, which is itself a form of historical erasure, the moral situation he was navigating seems almost impossibly complex. He was serving a government that existed under German sufferance. He was conducting a rescue requested by German Naval Command. He was rescuing soldiers of a nation whose warships had killed his colleagues 2 years earlier. And he was doing it, by all accounts, effectively and promptly. The Gloire picked up 52 British survivors while still 100 kilometers from the designated rendezvous point. She found them before she was supposed to, because her lookouts were doing their jobs. Over the following hours, she found 11 more lifeboats. By the time she rendezvoused with U-507 and U-506 at the designated meeting point on the afternoon of the 17th, she was already carrying British survivors. The final count taken aboard her represents the most complete tally of the rescue: 373 Italians, 70 Poles, and 597 British, including 48 women and children. That figure, 1,040 survivors on a single French warship, is larger than the confirmed total survivor count from all 4 submarines combined. The Gloire's efforts that day and the following night exemplify a quality of the Vichy French participation in this rescue that has been consistently underweighted in English-language accounts: the initiative they showed beyond their formal assignment. After the main rendezvous, the Gloire continued searching independently. At 10 in the evening on the 17th, her lookout spotted a light on the horizon, and rather than holding course for the planned next rendezvous with the Annamite, her captain diverted to investigate. 84 more survivors were found. A new rendezvous had to be arranged. At 9:30 on the morning of the 18th, she met the Annamite, which transferred her own survivors across. This was not a ship following minimum instructions. This was a ship actively expanding the scope of its rescue mission, burning extra fuel and time because there were people in the water. The historical record generally credits the Vichy French participation with a kind of neutral logistical role, the relief force that arrived after the drama was over. The operational detail doesn't support that characterization. The Annamite, the 660-ton sloop from Conakry, and the Dumont d'Urville, the 2,000-ton sloop from Cotonou, had different operational experiences than the Gloire. The Dumont d'Urville was the vessel that eventually rendezvoused with the Italian submarine Capellini, which had been unable to find the rendezvous point and had spent days at sea with survivors aboard awaiting instructions through a relay of command channels. When the Dumont d'Urville finally made contact, the transfer was completed, and the survivors, including the group that had produced Colonel Baldwin's letter of thanks, were moved to the French vessel for the transit to Casablanca. By chance, the Dumont d'Urville had also encountered a lifeboat from a completely different ship, the Treville, a British cargo vessel torpedoed in the same general area on the 12th of September and therefore caught in the same cluster of maritime disaster. The Dumont d'Urville searched for additional Treville survivors without success before proceeding to the rendezvous. The complexity of coordinating all this, multiple submarines, multiple sloops, one cruiser, survivors from at least 2 different ships, through partially broken radio contact and overlapping command chains in the open South Atlantic, is a logistical achievement that deserves more analytical respect than it usually receives. There is a significant discrepancy in the English-language sources about the total survivor figure that's worth flagging, because it gets at a fundamental question about what we actually know. The U-Boat.net figure suggests approximately 1,500 survived the sinking. The Wikipedia article on the incident gives a survivor range of 976 to 1,083. The Wikipedia article on the RMS Laconia itself states, around 1,500 survived the sinking. The Military.com reconstruction from December 2025 gives 1,113. These are not marginal differences. They range across more than 500 people. The discrepancy reflects, in part, the difficulty of taking a reliable count when survivors were scattered across 4 submarines, 3 French warships, multiple lifeboats, and the coast of Liberia simultaneously. The most conservative and carefully sourced figure, the one supported by the most detailed breakdown of individual manifests, is the 1,083 figure, which is the count confirmed when the French ships reached Dakar and Casablanca, and actual tallies could be taken. The higher figures include survivors who reached land independently, in the boats that made the long drift to Africa, and whose arrival times and numbers were logged separately and later. The survivors from all sources eventually reached Casablanca, and from there most were transported to the internment facility at Mediouna in Morocco to await German processing as prisoners. The Mediouna camp was a Vichy-administered facility in which British, Polish, and surviving Italian prisoners were held pending arrangements for their movement to Germany. They had been rescued from the Atlantic by German submarines, held briefly on French and Italian vessels, carried to Casablanca by Vichy-French warships, and were now being confined in a Vichy-French camp on the direct authority of the German-French Armistice Administration. The moral geography of their journey from the torpedoed Laconia to the Mediouna camp is baroque in its complexity. And then, on the 8th of November, 1942, 7 weeks after the sinking, the Allied Operation Torch landings began on the North African coast, and Allied forces moved inland, and the Mediouna camp was liberated. The survivors of the Laconia were evacuated and eventually transported to the United States aboard a vessel called the Anton. American soldiers who had waited ashore in Morocco had, weeks earlier, been dropping bombs on the German submarines engaged in rescuing those same people. The circuit of this story is one of the more extraordinary ironies in the entire history of the North African campaign, and I have never once seen it mentioned in an account of Operation Torch. Janet Walker's binoculars. There is a specific detail in the Laconia rescue story that I've kept coming back to across months of reading, not because it's strategically significant or legally consequential, but because it captures something that no operational summary can convey. Captain Lieutenant Haro Schacht, commanding U-507, had among his hundreds of rescued survivors a young British woman named Janet Walker. Walker had lost her small daughter, Doreen, in the initial chaos of the sinking. She didn't know where the child was. She didn't know if Doreen was alive. And Schacht, the commander of an enemy submarine in the middle of an active naval operation, repeatedly allowed Walker to come to the conning tower of his boat and borrow his binoculars to scan the horizon for her daughter. He went out of his way to approach nearby lifeboats to investigate. He couldn't find the child, but he kept letting her look. That image, a mother with a Kriegsmarine commander's binoculars, standing on the conning tower of a German submarine, searching the South Atlantic for a missing child, is the image I want to hold on to through this chapter, because it tells you something about what war actually costs that the casualty figures can't. Janet Walker had been putting Doreen to bed in her cabin when the torpedo struck. The child was small, old enough to walk, too young to survive alone in the water. In the chaos that followed, Walker had made it to a rope ladder near a lifeboat station. At some point in the scramble, another crew member had taken the child from her arms, promising to hand Doreen down once Walker was in the boat. Walker descended. She looked up. The sailor wasn't there. Doreen wasn't there. She tried to reboard the ship. An RAF officer went to search in her stead. He came back and told her the sailor must have taken the child to another lifeboat, that she'd see her daughter in the morning. Walker was rescued by U-507 on the 15th of September, 3 days after the sinking. She was frantic with worry. The documentary record, specifically the detailed account preserved in the HistoryNet reconstruction of April 2016, says that Schacht went out of his way to help her look. U-507 was conducting a major rescue operation with 491 people aboard. Schacht was managing an extraordinarily complex and dangerous situation, and he made time to let a grieving mother stand on his conning tower with his binoculars. The operational situation aboard U-507 during the rescue period is worth pausing on, because the scale of what Schacht was managing while also attending to Janet Walker is genuinely remarkable. 491 survivors, that figure is from the BDU War Diary as cited in the secondary literature, aboard a Type 9C submarine with a designed crew of between 48 and 56 men. 491 people, of whom 15 were women and 16 were children. The Type 9C had a pressure hull approximately 76 meters in length, with internal living quarters designed for roughly 50 humans. The mathematics of accommodating 491 people in that space don't work in any conventional sense. People were on the casing in the sun. People were in the torpedo storage spaces. People were in the control room. The internal atmosphere,
CO2 buildup, heat, the physical presence of hundreds of exhausted, traumatized, salt-soaked bodies would have been extreme by any physiological measure. And in the middle of that, Schacht was attending to the personal grief of a British civilian. Frank Holding's account describes being offered canned bread, soup, and a bottle of wine. Multiple survivors describe the same quality of treatment: correct, sometimes generous, occasionally surprising in its specificity. It doesn't absolve anything about the war, but it is what it is. Doreen Walker was not found, not by Schacht, not by any other vessel in the rescue fleet, not in the weeks that followed. The child's fate was, for some time, uncertain. Janet Walker searched the survivors aboard the Vichy French ships when the transfer was made. She moved through more than 1,000 people on the Gloire's decks, looking for a small face she recognized. She found nothing. After reaching Casablanca, she continued asking. Years after the war, the HistoryNet account states it was approximately a year after the sinking, a fellow survivor contacted Walker and told her what they had seen. A lifeboat had taken on a small child fitting Doreen's description during the initial lowering. The lifeboat had overturned. Everyone in it had gone into the sea. Walker, having received this account, finally accepted that her daughter was dead. The child's name does not appear in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission records under any verifiable listing. The machinery of official commemoration, which works by name and service number and date, didn't have adequate tools for a 14-month-old child who died in a lifeboat during a wartime maritime disaster. What Walker did after the war, the record of her searching, the fortune-tellers, the hope maintained over years, is preserved not in any official document, but in the survivor testimony reproduced in the HistoryNet article. She spent money on fortune-tellers, hoping they could tell her where Doreen was. She held on to the possibility for longer than the evidence warranted, because the evidence was incomplete, and because the alternative, accepting that her child had drowned at 14 months old in an overturned lifeboat in the South Atlantic, was something that only the most brutal clarity could enforce. The fact that years elapsed between the sinking and her final acceptance isn't a failure of rationality. It's what grief looks like when the official record doesn't have enough information to force a conclusion. The Merchant Navy Casualty Register, the Commonwealth War Graves records, the BDU War Diary, none of them had a space for Doreen Walker. She existed only in her mother's searching and, eventually, in the second-hand account of a fellow survivor. I've been thinking about Schacht and Walker, about the binoculars on the conning tower, in relation to a question that the rest of this story repeatedly poses but never quite answers. What is the relationship between individual moral behavior and institutional outcome? Schacht behaved with evident humanity. He conducted himself with decency toward people who were, by the definitions of the war he was fighting, his enemies. He disobeyed Donitz's order to dump the British survivors overboard. He searched for a child that belonged to a passenger on a ship his navy had sunk. And none of it changed the outcome for Doreen Walker. None of the individual human goodness that runs through the survivor testimonies, Hartenstein's charming helpfulness, Schacht's binoculars, Verdeman's refusal to obey the dump order, the bottle of wine given to Frank Holding, altered the structural conditions that had already killed more than 1,000 Italian prisoners before any submarine reached them. The individual decency was real. The institutional catastrophe was also real. They coexisted without resolving each other. Haro Schacht survived the war. He died in 1995. He commanded U-507 through the rest of the Laconia operation and continued in the U-boat service afterward. Whether Janet Walker ever knew the name of the man who lent her his binoculars, whether she knew at any point in the decades between 1942 and her own death that the German officer who had tried to help her had a name and a face and had survived the war, is not recorded anywhere in the sources I've found. That absence is its own kind of fact. The war produced thousands of acts of human contact across enemy lines, moments of recognition between people who were supposed to be abstractions to each other, and the historical record preserves almost none of them, because they happened at the level of individual experience rather than institutional decision. Schacht's binoculars, and the woman looking through them,
exist in the record only because a journalist or historian, decades later, thought to ask. Most of those moments weren't asked about. They just dissolved into the general silence of what wars do to the people who survive them. Sink, sub. 2 words and their consequences. At 12:32 in the afternoon on the 16th of September 1942, Lieutenant James D. Hardin made his first bomb run over U-156. He was flying a B-24D Liberator bomber out of the secret American air base on Ascension Island. This was his crew's first operational mission. The previous chapter established how he got there and what Richardson ordered. What this chapter is about is something different: the specific chain of failures, institutional, informational, legal, and procedural, that took a 2-word command and turned it into an act that American military lawyers 50 years later would formally describe as a war crime. Because sink sub was not shouted in rage. It was not given in ignorance of international law. It was issued as a routine operational order by a senior officer following the procedures he had been given. And that's the most disturbing thing about it. Richardson's 5 documented reasons for issuing the attack order, preserved in the 1964 article by Maurer and Pasek in the Royal United Services Institute Journal, the first public disclosure of the full decision-making chain, published 22 years after the event in a British journal rather than an American one, deserve to be treated as a primary source document rather than as a list of excuses. His first reason? International law did not permit a combat vessel to fly Red Cross flags during combat operations. His second? He believed U-156 was rescuing only Italian POWs, not Allied personnel. His third? The submarine might subsequently attack 2 Allied freighters known to be in the area. His fourth? The submarine's crew might discover and report the location of the secret Ascension Island air base and its fuel tanks, which would threaten the entire Allied resupply route to Egypt and the Soviet Union. His fifth? His rules of engagement required him to prosecute the attack when a submarine was positively identified. Each of these 5 reasons is factually testable. The first was legally incorrect. The 1929 Geneva Convention, which the United States had ratified, did not prohibit a warship from displaying Red Cross markings during genuine rescue operations. The second was factually wrong. The submarine had British, Polish, and civilian survivors aboard, a fact that had been transmitted in Hartenstein's open-frequency English-language broadcast 2 days earlier. The third didn't happen. The fourth didn't happen. The fifth assumes fourth didn't happen. The fifth assumes the first 4 are correct, which they weren't. But what I keep returning to, when I work through Richardson's decision in detail, is the information state he was actually operating in. Hartenstein had broadcast his rescue position and intentions on the 25-meter shortwave band at 6 in the morning on the 13th of September. The British at Freetown had intercepted and logged that broadcast. Then, on the 15th of September, 2 days after Hartenstein's broadcast, 1 day before the attack, the British at Freetown sent a message to the Americans at Ascension. Clay Blair, whose 1998 research remains the most thorough English-language reconstruction of this period, describes that message as poorly composed. It implied the Laconia had only just been sunk. It made no mention of the 3-day-old German rescue operation. It made no mention of Hartenstein's ceasefire broadcast. It made no mention of the Vichy French vessels already en route. Richardson received a message that told him a British troopship had been sunk near his operational area, with no context indicating anything other than a standard submarine attack. The entire humanitarian architecture of the situation, the Red Cross flag, the 3 days of rescue, the international broadcast, had been stripped from the information before it reached the man with the authority to act on it. The massacre wasn't produced by malice. It was produced by a single, specific, documented communication failure at the Freetown signal station, multiplied by Richardson's procedurally correct application of incomplete information. The mechanics of the attack itself contain a technical detail that's important for understanding the scale of the failure. The B-24D Liberator carried aboard a Norden bomb sight calibrated for medium to high-altitude precision bombing. Its design parameters were for attacks from above 5,000 feet against fixed or slow-moving targets. Hardin's anti-submarine attack was conducted at low level, approximately 250 feet on the final pass, well below the Norden's effective operating envelope. His first 3 attempts at bomb release failed entirely, a consistent pattern in the documented history of B-24 anti-submarine operations during this period, where crews trained for one mission type were being tasked with another. The bomb that successfully released on the 4th pass and landed among the lifeboats was dropped outside the parameters the aircraft was designed for, by a crew on their first mission using a targeting system not designed for the task. The people it killed had been rescued from the ocean 3 days earlier by the commander of the submarine they were towed behind. This is the chain of failures. Institutional silence, a garbled message, 5 incorrect assumptions, a technical mismatch, and an inexperienced crew. Add them up and they produce the same outcome as malice. Hardin's after-action report stated that U-156 had been sunk, that the sub rolled over and was last seen bottom up, and that crew had abandoned sub and taken to surrounding lifeboats. Neither statement was accurate. U-156 had dived and survived with hull damage to the control room and bow compartment. What had been sunk were 2 lifeboats. Hardin's crew received air medals for the alleged sinking. The medals were not revoked. The incident was classified. The 22-year gap between the attack and its first public accounting, Maurer and Pasek's 1964 article, was not the product of a coordinated conspiracy. It was, as best the sources allow us to reconstruct, the accumulation of individual institutional choices not to surface an embarrassing story. No single person decided to suppress it. Multiple people at multiple levels decided not to raise it. The aggregate effect was indistinguishable from deliberate cover-up. The families of the people killed in those lifeboats, people who had survived the original sinking, survived 3 days in the water, been pulled aboard a German submarine by a commander who'd spent 72 hours trying to save them, were not told what had killed their relatives. The official record, for 22 years, said nothing. The legal assessment that eventually emerged is worth quoting precisely rather than paraphrasing, because it represents the considered judgment of American military legal scholars, not German post-war advocacy. The Naval War College's International Law Studies series, Volume 65, published in 1993, contains a chapter by Mallison and Mallison examining the Laconia Incident in the context of World War II submarine warfare law. Their conclusion: the person who issued the order to attack and the aircraft commander who carried it out are both prima facie guilty of a war crime. The conduct of the aircraft commander appears to be entirely inexcusable, since he must have observed the rescue operation. And further, the fact that the United States Army Air Forces took no action to investigate this incident, and that no trials took place under the then-effective Domestic Criminal Code, the Articles of War, is a serious reflection on the entire chain of military command. That assessment, war crime, inexcusable, serious reflection on the entire chain of command, was written by American lawyers, published by the U.S. Naval War College 51 years after the attack. Richardson retired from the Air Force as a brigadier general in 1967. He died in 2011. There is no record of any investigation having ever been opened into his decision. The second American attack, on the 17th of September, when Hardin's B-24 located U-506, which had 151 survivors aboard, including 9 women and children, is less well documented but follows the same pattern. The bomb release failed on the first pass. On the second pass, 2 500-pound bombs and 2 350-pound depth charges were dropped, but caused no damage. U-506 crash-dived. It survived. The Vichy French ships arrived that same afternoon, and the survivor transfer was completed. It's worth noting the specific sequence of that day. An American aircraft attempted to destroy a submarine carrying 151 rescued survivors, including 9 women and children, in the morning. The rescue was completed successfully in the afternoon. Both things happened on the same day, in the same stretch of ocean. The historical record treats them as separate events. They weren't. The Laconia Order, Stay Hard. On the 17th of September 1942, the same day the second American attack on U-506 occurred, the same day the Vichy French ships completed the survivor transfer at the rendezvous point, Karl Donitz composed and transmitted a document that would alter the character of naval warfare for the remainder of the war and trigger a legal battle at Nuremberg that ended with one of the most extraordinary courtroom reversals of the entire post-war proceedings. The document was distributed to all active U-boat commands within 14 hours of composition. Its German title was Laconia Befehl. It became known in English as the Laconia Order. Its 4 paragraphs, reproduced in full on the uboat.net website and in multiple scholarly sources, are one of the most consequential short texts of the entire conflict. And one of those paragraphs was missing from Donitz's own published memoirs. The omission is more revealing than the paragraph itself. Donitz had received confirmation of both American attacks by the evening of the 16th. The second attack, on U-506, occurred the following morning. What his memoirs describe as a very heated discussion at headquarters preceded the order, a debate in which, by his own account, some of his most senior officers argued that it would be wholly unjustifiable to continue exposing submarines and their crews to aerial attack in the service of rescue operations. By the time Donitz composed the Laconia Befehl, he had watched the rescue operation he'd sanctioned get bombed twice by American aircraft, seen one of his most experienced commanders forced to abandon hundreds of people in the ocean, and received Hitler's prior order to discontinue the rescue entirely, an order he'd partially overridden in favor of completing the Vichy French handover. He was, in any fair reading of the circumstances, a man composing a policy response to a situation that had evolved far beyond any procedure his command had anticipated. The order he wrote reflected that state of mind. The first 3 paragraphs of the Laconia Order are operationally precise. Paragraph 1. All attempts to rescue the crews of sunken ships, pulling swimmers from the water, righting capsized lifeboats, providing food and water, are to cease. These activities contradict the fundamental demands of warfare, the destruction of enemy ships and their crews. Paragraph 2. The standing orders regarding the taking of ship captains and chief engineers as prisoners remain in effect. Paragraph 3. Survivors are to be rescued only if their information is of operational value to the boat. These 3 paragraphs end what had been, until September 1942, a widespread if informal practice among U-boat crews of providing torpedoed survivors with water, rations, compass bearings, and occasionally medical care. Clay Blair's research documents numerous instances of this practice across the pre-Laconia U-boat record. The Laconia Order terminated it officially and categorically. It was, in its first 3 paragraphs, a military policy document responding to a specific military situation. It was harsh. It was arguably a violation of the Naval Protocol of 1936. But it had a comprehensible military logic. The 4th paragraph is different in kind. The HistoryNet account of the incident, drawing on the full German text of the order as it was introduced at Nuremberg, quotes its final sentences as, "Be hard. Don't forget that the enemy didn't take any regard for women and children when bombarding German towns." The German phrase "bleibt hart," stay hard, is the injunction Donitz used to close a military order about rescue procedures. That phrase is not operational language. It doesn't belong in the same document as paragraphs about captains and chief engineers. It's the language of a man who is angry, who feels that his command's humanity has been weaponized against them, and who wants his submarine commanders to understand that the humanitarian instinct which produced the Laconia rescue is now, in his view, a liability. The HistoryNet article, drawing on the original documentation used at Nuremberg, confirms that this paragraph appeared in the order as transmitted to the fleet. It also confirms, drawing on the record of Donitz's published memoirs, that he left it out when he wrote his account of the incident in the 1950s. The deletion is not ambiguous. It is the act of a man who understood, in retrospect, that "stay hard" was indefensible in peacetime terms, and chose to present a version of his wartime decisions that omitted the most revealing sentence. The Laconia Order's practical effect on U-boat operational culture during the remainder of the war was more nuanced than the order itself suggests. Despite the categorical prohibition in paragraph 1, U-boat crews continued, on documented occasions through 1943, 1944, and into 1945, to provide assistance to survivors when their tactical situation allowed it. The Military.com article on the Nuremberg proceedings notes that Donitz's defense lawyer, Otto Kranzbuehler, gathered statements from 66 German submarine commanders describing specific instances of post-Laconia Order assistance to survivors. The order ended the formal permission to help. It didn't end the human instinct that had produced the Laconia rescue in the first place. That's not an exoneration of Donitz. It's an observation about the limits of institutional orders when applied to human behavior. The order prohibited. Individuals continued, in smaller and quieter ways, to resist that prohibition. What the Laconia Order did unambiguously end was the large-scale, coordinated, multi-submarine rescue of the kind Hartenstein had organized. That kind of operation, submarines on the surface for days, broadcasting their positions, towing lifeboats, receiving women and children, required not just individual willingness, but institutional permission. The Laconia Order revoked that permission permanently. After September 1942, no U-boat commander in the German Navy could authorize a Laconia-scale rescue without explicitly violating a standing order from the Commander-in-Chief of the submarine force. The informal humanity that continued was small, quiet, and deniable. The structured mercy, the Red Cross flags, the English-language broadcasts, the 4 submarines and 3 Vichy warships, was over. The order was issued on the 17th of September. On the same day, Hartenstein received notification that he had been awarded Germany's Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, the highest military decoration in the German armed forces. He was the 63rd member of the U-boat service and the 125th of the Kriegsmarine to receive it. According to the account preserved in the Hartenstein biography by Roll, he issued a bottle of beer to each crew member and told them he would wear the decoration in their name. The Knight's Cross for sinking the Laconia, and for what came after. The same day he received the order never to do what he'd just done again. There's something almost unbearable in that juxtaposition, and I don't think it needs any embellishment. Nuremberg, when the rescue became a war crime. The Nuremberg International Military Tribunal convened its proceedings against the major German war criminals beginning in November 1945 and concluded on the 1st of October 1946. Among the defendants were 21 senior officials of the Nazi state and military. Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, who had been, briefly, Hitler's successor as head of state following Hitler's death on the 30th of April 1945, and who had overseen the unconditional German surrender, sat in the dock as a defendant charged with, among other things, waging unrestricted submarine warfare in violation of the Naval Protocol of 1936 and issuing an order, the Laconia Befehl, that the prosecution contended authorized the murder of shipwrecked survivors. The prosecution introduced the Laconia Order as the centerpiece of the submarine warfare case. They believed they had a strong document. What they didn't anticipate was what the document's full history would do to their argument once the defense was permitted to tell it. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. The Laconia Order, in prohibiting rescue of survivors, effectively ordered U-boat commanders to ensure that torpedoed sailors drowned rather than survived. Under the Naval Protocol of 1936, which Germany had acceded to, submarine warfare was required to observe certain humanitarian constraints, including provision for the safety of survivors where this was operationally possible. The Laconia Order violated those constraints explicitly. The prosecution presented this as evidence of a deliberate policy of murder by the German submarine command, a policy reflecting the broader Nazi ideology of contempt for the lives of enemy personnel. The argument had surface plausibility and documentary support, but it contained a structural vulnerability. The same argument, applied to Allied submarine practice, would equally condemn the navies of the United States and Great Britain. Dönitz's defense lawyer, Otto Kranzbühler, had identified this vulnerability. Working from, by his own account, a book he found in a library about American submarine operations in the Pacific, he understood that the United States Navy had been conducting unrestricted submarine warfare against Japan from the 7th of December 1941, the first day of American involvement in the war. Not selectively, not reluctantly, but as declared policy from the first day. He requested permission to take written testimony from Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, the wartime commander-in-chief of the United States Pacific Fleet, and, at the time of the Nuremberg trials, the serving chief of naval operations. The tribunal approved. Nimitz answered questions under oath, in writing, confirming that American submarines had attacked Japanese merchant vessels without warning from the first day of the Pacific War, across 30 million square miles of ocean, and that American submarine commanders were not expected to rescue enemy survivors if doing so would jeopardize their mission or vessel. The confirmation was unambiguous, and it was devastating to the prosecution's case, because it established that the Laconia Order described a policy that the United States itself had followed, and had followed from the beginning, not as a response to being bombed while conducting rescues, but as deliberate preemptive doctrine. Kranzbühler went further. He introduced evidence that the British Admiralty had issued an order on the 8th of May, 1940, before the Laconia Incident, before the Laconia Order, requiring that all vessels be sunk on sight in the Skagerrak. He presented the statements from 66 German submarine commanders documenting instances of post-Laconia Order assistance to survivors when tactical conditions permitted. He placed the Laconia Order in the context of the B-24 attacks, establishing, through the operational record, that the order was a direct response to an Allied attack on a protected rescue operation, not a freestanding expression of Nazi ideology. The prosecution had no effective reply to any of this, because the evidence Kranzbühler introduced was accurate. The Nimitz affidavit confirmed American practice. The British Admiralty order confirmed British practice. The 66 survivor accounts complicated the simple narrative of systematic murder. And the B-24 attack, documented through both German and American records, established the causal chain between the Allied bombing and the German order. The tribunal's ruling on the submarine warfare charges against Dönitz is one of the more carefully phrased passages in the entire Nuremberg judgment, and it's worth reading slowly. The Avalon Project at Yale Law School hosts the full text. The tribunal found that the evidence did not establish, with the certainty required, that Dönitz deliberately ordered the killing of shipwrecked survivors. It described the Laconia Order as undoubtedly ambiguous, and said it deserved the strongest censure. It found that Dönitz was guilty of a violation of the Naval Protocol. The order was a breach of the 1936 agreement, technically speaking. But then it added, in view of all the facts proved, and in particular of an order of the British Admiralty announced on the 8th of May 1940 and the answers to interrogatories by Admiral Chester Nimitz, stating unrestricted submarine warfare was carried on in the Pacific Ocean by the United States from the first day of the Pacific War, the sentence of Dönitz is not assessed on the ground of his breaches of the international law of submarine warfare. He was found guilty of the breach. He was not punished for it. Because if Dönitz was to be punished for the Laconia Order, logical consistency required that Chester Nimitz's orders be examined in the same court, under the same standard, by the same panel. Dönitz was convicted on 2 other charges: crimes against peace, for his role in Germany's aggressive war, and war crimes for specific conduct related to the Naval High Command's broader activities. He received a 10-year sentence and served every day of it at Spandau Prison in Berlin, being released in 1956. He died in 1980. After his release, approximately 120 American admirals signed letters stating that Dönitz's conviction was unjust. The Pentagon's legal study of the Laconia Incident, published in 1993, concluded that Richardson and Hardin were guilty of war crimes and that Hardin's actions were entirely inexcusable given what he had observed. Richardson retired as a brigadier general in 1967. He faced no investigation and no proceedings. He died in 2011. The asymmetry between the legal treatment of Donitz, tried, convicted, imprisoned, and the legal treatment of Richardson, untried, decorated, pensioned, is not a detail of historical interest. It is the most important fact about how the Laconia incident was processed by the post-war legal and institutional order. What the Nuremberg proceedings revealed, without intending to, is that the legal framework being applied at the trial was not designed to produce justice in the abstract. It was designed to produce accountability for the specific crimes of the specific defeated regime. That's not a cynical observation. It's what the Nimitz testimony forced onto the record. Two submarine forces following substantially identical operational policies, one of them in the dock, one of them providing testimony in its defense. The post-war legal order, for all its genuine achievements in establishing international criminal accountability, drew its line along the boundary of victory and defeat, rather than the boundary of what was and wasn't permissible under international law. The Laconia incident sat exactly on that line, and what the tribunal found, when it got there, was that the line couldn't be held. Not with Nimitz's affidavit in the record, and the truth of Allied submarine practice available to anyone who cared to check. Donitz served his time. Richardson served his career. And the precise distinction between those two outcomes is, depending on how you read the evidence, either the most honest thing the post-war international legal order ever said about itself, or the most damning. Sharpe's two ships. There is a name that runs through both of Britain's worst wartime maritime disasters, like a thread that nobody seems to have noticed, or perhaps that nobody wanted to notice. Captain Rudolph Sharpe commanded the RMS Lancastria when she was bombed and sunk off Saint-Nazaire on the 17th of June, 1940. He survived. Then he commanded the RMS Laconia when she was torpedoed and sunk in the South Atlantic on the 12th of September, 1942. He didn't survive that one. The Lancastria sinking produced a death toll that, at conservative modern estimates, stands at no fewer than 3,500 people, with estimates ranging as high as 7,000. Making it the single worst maritime disaster in British history. The Laconia killed somewhere between 1,658 and 1,757. Sharpe commanded both ships. In the historical literature on either disaster, this connection is mentioned at most in a single sentence before the narrative moves on. I've spent considerable time looking at why, and the answer I keep arriving at is that the connection is awkward in ways that the standard historical framing, both disasters as external catastrophes inflicted on Britain by enemy action, doesn't have room to examine. The Lancastria was built by William Beardmore and Company at Dalmuir on the River Clyde. She was launched in May 1920 and made her maiden voyage in June 1922, originally trading as RMS Terenia, until a name change in 1924. She was 16,243 gross register tons, 578 feet long, powered by 6 steam turbines of 2,500 nominal horsepower, driving twin propellers at 16.5 knots. Slightly more modest in her dimensions than the Laconia, but broadly comparable as a peacetime ocean liner converted for wartime trooping. On the 17th of June, 1940, she was at anchor in the Charpentier Roads, approximately 9 nautical miles from Saint-Nazaire, loading British troops and civilian refugees as part of Operation Ariel, the evacuation of British nationals and military personnel from France in the chaotic final days before the French armistice. She had been told by the naval officer coordinating the loading to take as many people as she possibly could, without regard to the limits of international law. Captain Sharpe had answered that he could take 3,000 at a pinch. He was told to take more. By the afternoon, estimates of the number of people aboard ranged from 4,000 to over 7,000, in a ship with a peacetime passenger capacity of 1,300. At approximately 10 minutes to 4 in the afternoon, Lancastria was hit by German bombs during an air raid. The Wikipedia article on the sinking, drawing on Jonathan Finby's meticulous 1995 research, records that 3 or possibly 4 bombs struck the ship in rapid succession, striking holds 2 and 3 and close to the funnel, rupturing the fuel oil tanks and causing immediate catastrophic flooding. She capsized and sank within 20 minutes. The lifeboats, she carried 16, could not all be launched because of the angle of the hull and damage from the bombing. Many of the thousands of people in the ship's cargo holds, packed in far beyond any operational design parameter, had no way out. The fuel oil that spread across the water added another layer of horror to what the survivors described. Rudolph Sharp was in command of a ship that carried perhaps 4 times her designed capacity and sank in 20 minutes. He survived. Churchill immediately suppressed the news through the D-Notice system, reportedly telling his staff that the newspapers have got quite enough disaster for today at least. In his later memoirs, Churchill wrote that he'd intended to release the news a few days later, but that events in France crowded upon us so black and so quickly that I forgot to lift the ban. The story was finally broken by the American Press Association more than 5 weeks after the sinking. The contrast in sinking time between the 2 ships Sharp commanded is something that strikes me as technically significant and historically underexamined. The Lancastria sank in roughly 20 minutes. The Laconia took approximately 61 minutes from the first torpedo strike to her final plunge. The difference is explained by the nature of the damage. The Lancastria was struck by multiple high-explosive bombs that opened several hull sections simultaneously and ruptured her fuel tanks, creating a catastrophic flooding rate across multiple compartments. The Laconia received 2 torpedoes in a more controlled pattern, and her double-bottom construction, combined with the oil drums that had been fitted to her internal spaces in 1940 specifically to improve her survivability if torpedoed, slowed the flooding enough to give passengers and crew the better part of an hour. The precautionary modification made in 1940, the oil drums in the walls, probably saved lives on the 12th of September 1942. That detail doesn't appear in any account I found of the Laconia sinking. It deserves to. Someone in the Admiralty made a sound engineering decision 2 years before the torpedo hit, and it mattered. Sharp survived the Lancastria catastrophe and was given command of another large troopship. The documentary record offers no explanation of the decision-making behind that assignment. No surviving inquiry into his conduct during the Lancastria sinking. No formal assessment of his performance in the evacuation. No record of any psychological evaluation or rest period. He simply reappears, in the records, in command of the Laconia. The question of whether that reassignment represented the Royal Navy's confidence in his abilities as a commander of large vessels in difficult circumstances, or whether it represented an institutional failure to process what the Lancastria disaster had been and what surviving it might have done to the man who commanded her, is one that the official record declines to answer. What can be said is this. Sharp was given a second ship. That ship was also lost with catastrophic casualties, and Sharp was among the dead. His entry in the Merchant Navy casualty records is 9 words. There is no cross-reference to the Lancastria. The official administrative record treats his 2 disasters as unconnected events because connecting them would require the system to ask a question the system had no procedure for answering. Sharp's body was never recovered. He appears in the available records simply as lost with his ship on the 12th of September, 1942. Multiple survivor testimonies confirm he was on the Laconia's bridge during the sinking and that he gave the order to abandon ship. Beyond that, the record goes silent. He isn't in the survivor testimony in the way that some other officers are, placed at a specific moment, quoted, described. He commanded the situation as well as it could be commanded in the minutes between the torpedo strike and the sinking, and then he disappeared into the same ocean that had claimed 16,243 tons of the Lancastria in June 1940. 2 ships, Both canard liners converted for wartime service. Both lost with catastrophic casualties. The same man on the bridge. The Lancastria is now recognized by the Scottish government with a commemorative medal and annual remembrance services. The British government formally acknowledged it, at Prime Minister's questions, only in June 2015, 75 years after the sinking. Captain Sharp has no memorial I've been able to identify. He has 9 words in a casualty register. The Lancastria wreck site lies in French territorial waters, approximately 9 nautical miles southwest of Saint-Nazaire, at a depth that makes it accessible to divers. The French government has designated it a legally protected war grave. The Laconia wreck lies at 4,230 meters in the South Atlantic, well below any practicable diving or archaeological access. The Italian prisoners who died in her lower holds are beyond reach of any memorial technology currently available. Sharp commands both wrecks from the register, the one accessible enough to have had a memorial unveiled on its anniversary, and the one that will never have anything placed at its location by human hands. There's an odd symmetry in that, though I'm not sure what it resolves. The two ships bracket a specific period in British wartime maritime history, the desperate improvisation of 1940, the grinding operational reality of 1942. And the man who commanded both of them sits between those two dates without a monument, without an inquiry, and without, as far as the available record shows, a single document from the Royal Navy asking what those two experiences might have meant for the person who lived through the first and died in the second. One common enemy, the moral geometry of the open sea. In Jim McLaughlin's memoir, One Common Enemy, published in Australia in 2006 by Wakefield Press, there is a conversation reproduced from the deck of U-156 that has stayed with me longer than almost any other single passage in the entire archive of this story. Hartenstein, according to McLaughlin's account, approached him on the submarine's deck and asked him whether he was in the Royal Navy. McLaughlin said he was. Hartenstein then asked him why, in that case, the ship had been armed, and said, in McLaughlin's recollection, "If she wasn't armed, I would not have attacked." McLaughlin titled his book after what he drew from that exchange, the idea that, in that moment, on that deck, in the middle of the South Atlantic, a German submarine commander and a British sailor had found exactly one thing in common: the recognition that the attack had been, in some sense that mattered to the man who had ordered it, a mistake. Not a crime, not an atrocity, not an expression of ideology. A military targeting decision made in good faith against a legitimate target that had produced consequences the commander hadn't anticipated and genuinely wished he hadn't caused. That is the space in which this chapter lives. The moral landscape of the Laconia rescue, if I can use that phrase without it becoming a euphemism for something more complex, is populated by individual human acts that refuse to be organized into a clean narrative. There's Hartenstein, charming and helpful to Doris Hawkins, who described him as behaving as though entertaining us in peacetime. There's Schacht with his binoculars and the 491 people sleeping on his torpedo tubes. There's Verdeman, quietly disobeying Donitz's written order to dump the British survivors and keeping everyone aboard. There's the unnamed crew member on U-156 who gave Frank Holding a fistful of cigarettes after dressing his wounds. And then there's the man on Holding's lifeboat who had, earlier that same afternoon, offered him a hatchet to chop off Italian fingers. These things all happened in the same afternoon, to the same man, in the same square mile of ocean. The moral range of human behavior in that situation, from the most brutal to the most generous, was compressed into hours, and none of it can be made to add up to a single lesson. What I want to try to articulate in this chapter, drawing on the survivor testimony as a body of evidence rather than a collection of individual stories, is something about what the open sea does to the categories that war imposes. The categories were real: German, British, Italian, Polish, prisoner, guard, combatant, civilian. The entire administrative and legal architecture of the Laconia's manifest depended on those categories holding. But the categories didn't survive the water. Hawkins, the British missionary nurse, describes Hartenstein with genuine warmth and without irony.
Holding describes his crew receiving care from men whose navy had torpedoed the ship they were standing on 2 hours earlier. Colonel Baldwin signed a formal letter of thanks to the captain of an Axis submarine. McLaughlin titled his book after a conversation in which an enemy commander expressed regret for what he'd done. The survivor testimony, taken as a whole, describes a situation in which the categories of the war dissolved. Not universally, not permanently, but repeatedly and specifically, and were replaced, in those moments, by something more like the recognition that everyone in the water was in the same water, and the practical arithmetic of survival required treating them accordingly. The Frank Holding cigarette moment is the detail I find most useful as a moral barometer, precisely because it's so small. Holding had spent the previous hours in a lifeboat where someone had offered him a hatchet to use against Italian hands on the gunwale. Then he got aboard the German submarine and had his wounds dressed and was given a fistful of cigarettes. The same man, the same afternoon, in two entirely different moral environments. What changed wasn't the war. The war was still happening. What changed was the immediate social situation. In the overcrowded, panicked lifeboat, the logic of survival produced the hatchet offer. On the deck of a German submarine, whose commander was conducting a rescue operation, the logic of the situation produced cigarettes and wound dressing. Holding went back to the lifeboat with the cigarettes, and, according to his account, Schacht then came alongside and gave the whole boat canned bread, soup, and a bottle of wine. The same war, different situations, different human behavior. There's no grand principle in this. It's just what happened. The Colonel Baldwin letter, the formal written expression of gratitude from British military officers to the Italian submarine Capellini's captain, is the document that, to me, best encapsulates the moral complexity of the entire incident. It was a military document, signed by officers on behalf of their services, using the formal register of military courtesy. It wasn't a private letter from one person to another. It was an institutional act, conducted through proper channels, as formally as the filing of an after-action report. And what it said was, "Thank you for treating us as humans when you didn't have to." That's not actually a politically complicated statement, but in the context of September 1942, when two Axis submarines and their crews had spent days keeping Allied soldiers and civilians alive in the South Atlantic against direct orders from their commanding admiral, the act of British military officers formally acknowledging it in writing required a kind of moral clarity that cut across every category the war had established. They signed it, they delivered it. It's in the record. What ended all of this, what terminated the specific moral environment that the Laconia rescue had created, was the Laconia Order. After the 17th of September 1942, the formal institutional permission for the kind of behavior that Hartenstein, Schacht, and Verdeman had demonstrated was revoked. The individual decency continued in smaller, quieter, deniable ways. Donitz's lawyer gathered 66 testimonies of post-order assistance to survivors. But the large-scale rescue, the open broadcast, the Red Cross flag, the bottle of wine on the lifeboat, all of that required institutional sanction, and the institutional sanction was withdrawn. What replaced it wasn't necessarily cruelty. It was, rather, the default condition of unrestricted warfare in which survivors were problems rather than obligations. The Laconia rescue had been an interruption of that default. The order restored it. And what was lost when the order was issued wasn't just a policy, it was a specifically demonstrated possibility that submarine crews, given the space to choose, would often choose to help. The order removed the space. The question that the survivor testimony leaves open, the one that McLaughlin's title gestures toward without quite answering, is what the common enemy actually was. Not each other, clearly. Hartenstein's remark to McLaughlin suggests he understood that the military categories were being applied to a situation that had outrun the categories. Not the war itself, though that's the romantic reading. I think what the survivors collectively describe, without using this language, is something more practical. The common enemy was the South Atlantic Ocean, the heat, the sharks, the thirst, the mathematics of lifeboat capacity and water ration.
The enemy was the physical situation they were all in together, regardless of which flag their dead ships had flown. And the specific human quality that the rescue demonstrated, the quality that the Laconia order was designed to extinguish, was the recognition that the physical situation superseded the political one, and that the person drowning next to you in the South Atlantic deserved a rope, regardless of their nationality. That recognition is not sentiment. It's also not law. It's older than either. And for a few days in September 1942, 4 submarine commanders and 3 Vichy French warship captains acted on it. Werner Hartenstein's last day. On the 8th of March, 1943, approximately 6 months and 24 days after U-156 fired the torpedoes that started everything in this story, a United States Navy PBY Catalina flying boat from Patrol Squadron 53, designated VP-53, aircraft designation P-1, piloted by Lieutenant E. Dryden, located U-156 on the surface of the Atlantic Ocean east of the island of Barbados. The Wikipedia article on Hartenstein gives the coordinates of the sinking as 12 degrees 38 minutes north, 54 degrees 39 minutes west. The Catalina dropped 4 Mark 44 Torpex depth bombs from between 75 and 100 feet altitude, straddling the submarine. 2 of the bombs hit the water 10 to 15 feet to starboard and just aft of the pressure hull. The force of the explosions lifted the submarine and broke it in two. U-156 sank with all hands. Hartenstein was 35 years old. He had joined the Reichsmarine as a cadet in 1928, served on surface vessels through the Spanish Civil War and the early years of the Second World War, transferred to submarines in 1941, commanded U-156 on 5 patrols, and been credited with sinking ships totaling 97,504 gross register tons. He had also, 6 months before his death, spent 3 days attempting to save the lives of people his submarine had put in the water. The German Navy's official records list him as missing in action from the 12th of March, 1943, the date on which U-boat headquarters first formally requested a status report that U-156 could not answer. The Catalina crew's post-attack account, as preserved in the Hartenstein Wikipedia article drawing on the detailed role biography, records that at least 11 survivors were seen swimming in the water after U-156 broke apart. The Americans dropped 2 rubber rafts and rations into the water. 5 men were seen to reach one of the rafts. The USS Barney was dispatched from Trinidad to search for survivors. The search was formally abandoned on the 12th of March, 1943. No survivors were recovered. The ration drop, the gesture of dropping supplies to men in the water without being able to or choosing to recover them directly, is a detail I find myself returning to without being able to resolve it into any clean moral category. It was more than the B-24 crew did in September 1942, when they dropped nothing. It was less than what Hartenstein had done in the same ocean with the same kind of survivors 6 months earlier. 5 men possibly reached a raft. The Barney searched for 4 days. Nobody was found. The last message U-156 sent to BDU headquarters, transmitted on the 7th of March 1943, the day before the sinking, is preserved in the Hartenstein Wikipedia article and is one of the more practically significant last signals in the U-boat war. It reported heavy Allied air surveillance in the area of operations, the uselessness of the METOX radar warning receiver that German submarines had been relying on to detect Allied radar emissions, and, presciently, the precision of Allied aerial attacks conducted at night without searchlights. This last observation was describing the Allied centimetric radar systems that had been deployed against U-boats and which the METOX receiver couldn't detect. Hartenstein was, in his last operational communication, reporting intelligence about the technological conditions of his own vulnerability that headquarters would use to try to address the mounting U-boat losses of early 1943. It's the signal of a professional naval officer doing his job to the last day. The BDU logged the message, requested a follow-up report on the 12th, and repeated the request on the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 24th of March. No response ever came. The Knight's Cross that Hartenstein received on the 17th of September 1942, the same day Donitz issued the Laconia order, was awarded, per the standard citation structure, for his total tonnage sunk over his patrol career. By the conventions of the Kriegsmarine's decoration system, the Knight's Cross was presented when a commander reached a specific threshold of enemy shipping destroyed, the threshold adjusting as the war progressed and the supply of available targets changed. Hartenstein had at that point been credited with 19 ships and approximately 97,000 gross register tons, figures that include the Laconia's 19,695 tons. The decoration was for the sinking. The rescue was not mentioned in the citation. When Hartenstein issued a bottle of beer to each crew member and told them he would wear the decoration in their name, he was celebrating, or at least formally marking, a career of destruction that included the event he had just spent 3 days trying to partially undo. That juxtaposition was apparently unremarkable to the German Navy's administrative system, which processed decorations by tonnage regardless of what happened after the torpedoes hit. Hartenstein was born in Plauen, in the Kingdom of Saxony, on the 27th of February, 1908. He applied for a naval cadetship, was initially rejected, studied law briefly at the University of Freiburg, and was accepted on his second application, joining the Reichsmarine on the 1st of April, 1928. He served on cruisers, torpedo boats, and survey vessels through the 1930s and participated in the Spanish Civil War aboard the torpedo boat Greif. By the time he took command of U-156 in September 1941, he had accumulated 15 years of naval experience across multiple platforms and operational environments. His career record up to the Laconia Incident is that of a capable and experienced officer with no particular distinguishing characteristics beyond professional competence. After the Laconia Incident, he was a man who had done something that nobody else in the U-boat war had done, and nobody would be allowed to do again. Whether he understood the full weight of that distinction, whether he knew, receiving his Knight's Cross on the 17th of September, that the order issued the same day meant his rescue was the last of its kind, is not recorded anywhere in the sources I've found. He went back to sea in January 1943. He was dead in March. The war continued for another 26 months without him. There is a memorial to Hartenstein in Germany. I want to be specific about what it commemorates, because the specificity matters. Per the accounts in the historical literature, his official naval memorial identifies him primarily by his tonnage figures. His record as a submarine commander is what the German Navy chose to preserve. The Laconia rescue, the event by which he is remembered internationally, the event that generated the incident and the order and the Nuremberg case and the legal legacy, isn't the thing the official record chose to lead with. It's as though the rescue happened to him rather than being something he chose. The tonnage is what the machine counted. The rescue is what the machine didn't know how to count. Hartenstein's parents received a letter from Korvettenkapitan Ernst Kahls, chief of the 2nd U-boat flotilla at Lorient, on the 23rd of April 1943, informing them that their son had been posted as missing in action as of the 12th of March. 10 months later, in January 1944, a memorial service was held in Plauen. The local press recorded that his parents had accepted that their loving son will not return home but is resting in peace with his Lord. He was 35. He rests, more precisely, at 12 degrees 38 minutes north, 54 degrees 39 minutes west, in the Atlantic Ocean, in a depth that the sources don't specify, but that is, like the Laconia herself, beyond the reach of any practical memorial. The footnote that became a rule, what the Laconia changed. 4,230 meters. That's the depth of the Laconia wreck. Deeper than the Titanic. Beyond the reach of sport divers, beyond the reach of most remotely operated vehicles currently in civilian service, beyond the reach of any archaeology that would permit the recovery or identification of remains. The Italian prisoners who died in the lower holds on the night of the 12th of September, 1942, are still in those holds. The wreck has never been formally designated a war grave under British law. The Protection of Military Remains Act of 1986 has no jurisdiction over a site in international waters in the South Atlantic. There is no annual memorial ceremony. There is no national monument in Italy to the 1,420 Italian soldiers who represent the largest single-nationality death event of the incident. Men who were prisoners of a war they'd lost, dying in a ship they hadn't chosen, in an ocean most of them had never seen. The Laconia sits at the bottom of the Atlantic, unvisited and uncommemorated, and the story of what happened there and what it changed has been working its way into international law and naval doctrine and maritime safety standards for more than 80 years, mostly without anyone noting that it came from there. The most immediate institutional consequence of the sinking was also the most practical and the least discussed. Churchill's order, issued shortly after the incident became known at the highest levels of the British government, that no more than 500 prisoners of war were to be transported on any single vessel. This is documented in the historical literature. The Wikipedia article on the Laconia Incident cites Bob Moore's 2022 study, Prisoners of War, Europe, 1939 to 1956, as the source. 500. The Laconia had been carrying 1,793. The order reduced the potential scale of any future disaster by a factor of approximately 3.5. It was announced without fanfare, implemented quietly, and is never mentioned in popular accounts of the Laconia incident, despite being the most direct and concrete policy response to it. The Laconia order gets a chapter in every treatment of the Battle of the Atlantic. Churchill's 500 prisoner rule gets a footnote, if that. The historical prominence we assign to specific policy responses says more about what makes a compelling narrative than about what actually changed the most lives. The legal legacy of the Laconia incident runs through multiple independent streams, and tracking all of them requires a certain amount of patience with institutional bureaucracy. The Second Geneva Convention of the 12th of August 1949, which superseded the 1929 convention that had been enforced during the war and that Richardson's attack had violated, addressed the protection of wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea. Article 12 of that convention states that parties to an armed conflict shall, without delay, take all possible measures to search for and collect the shipwrecked, wounded, and sick. The phrase "without delay" and the phrase "all possible measures" were both the subject of extended drafting debate at the diplomatic conference. The ICRC commentary records the historical context of these discussions, including reference to wartime cases of failing to rescue shipwrecked persons. The convention made legally binding what the Laconia rescue had demonstrated could actually be achieved by submarine crews in the middle of a combat operation. It codified the possibility that Hartenstein had proven and the order had suppressed. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, adopted in 1998 and entering into force in 2002, contains an explicit prohibition against what international lawyers call the tu quoque defense, the argument that a defendant cannot be convicted of a war crime if the opposing belligerent committed comparable acts. That prohibition was specifically motivated by the Nuremberg precedent set in the Donitz case. When Nimitz's testimony collapsed the submarine warfare prosecution by establishing that Allied navies had followed comparable doctrine, the resulting outcome, Donitz convicted but not sentenced for that count, was widely regarded in the post-war legal community as an unacceptable precedent because it made the enforceability of the laws of war dependent on the comparative misconduct of belligerents rather than on absolute legal standards. The Rome Statute's Article 31, which limits available defenses in international criminal court proceedings and specifically excludes the tu quoque principle, was drafted in direct response to what happened in Courtroom 600 at Nuremberg, when Kronzbühler produced the Nimitz affidavit. The Laconia Order's legal legacy includes, therefore, a direct contribution to the structural architecture of the court that prosecutes war crimes in 2026. The connection runs through the record. The Safety of Life at Sea Conventions, SOLAS, are the international framework governing minimum safety standards for vessels carrying people at sea, administered through the International Maritime Organization. The SOLAS framework was substantially revised in 1960, following a series of post-war reviews that drew on Atlantic convoy experience and wartime maritime disasters to establish new minimum standards for lifeboat capacity, water provisions, survival equipment, and emergency procedures. The 15-gallon water figure that Doris Hawkins documented in Lifeboat 9, the number that was entirely inadequate for 69 people over 27 days, was part of the evidence base. The 1974 SOLAS revision, which remains the framework currently in force with subsequent amendments, contains specific minimum water provisions per person per lifeboat that are calculated against survival time in tropical conditions.
Those calculations were made by naval architects and survival physiologists who worked from documented historical cases. The Laconia lifeboats were among the cases they worked from. The people who revised the survival water standard probably didn't know the names of the people who had died of thirst in Lifeboat 9, but the standard they wrote was partly a response to those deaths. The naval legal legacy of the incident is perhaps the most precisely traceable strand. The Naval War College's International Law Studies series, which had published the Mallison and Mallison assessment of the Laconia incident as a prima facie war crime in 1993, became a reference point for subsequent legal scholarship on the laws of naval warfare. The San Remo Manual on International Law Applicable to Armed Conflicts at Sea, produced in 1994 by a group of naval law experts convened by the International Institute of Humanitarian Law, addresses the obligations of belligerents toward shipwrecked persons with specificity that draws directly from the lessons of the Second World War. Section by section, the manual works through the conditions under which submarines are obligated to render assistance, the circumstances under which that obligation can be weighed against vessel safety, and the specific conditions, flying a Red Cross flag, broadcasting rescue intentions, maintaining a ceasefire, under which a rescue operation is legally protected from attack. The Laconia scenario, a submarine, a Red Cross flag, a rescue broadcast on an open frequency, an aircraft ordered to attack, sits behind every paragraph of the relevant sections, even when it isn't named. The Maurer and Pazek article of 1964, the first public reckoning with Richardson's decision-making, was published not in an American military journal, but in the Royal United Services Institute Journal in Britain. American military historians did not conduct the first substantive post-mortem of an American war crime committed against British and Italian survivors. British ones did, 22 years after the fact. The Military.com article from December 2025, perhaps the most recent substantial public treatment of the incident, notes that Richardson retired as a brigadier general in 1967 and died in 2011, and that records show little about what happened to Lieutenant Hardin after the war. The Pentagon's legal study of the incident, published in 1993, concluded that both Richardson and Hardin were guilty of war crimes, and that Hardin's conduct was entirely inexcusable, given what he had observed from the cockpit. Nobody was ever charged. Nobody was ever investigated. The air medals were not revoked. The declassification of the relevant documents began decades after the event and was never accompanied by any official acknowledgement, apology, or administrative review. The families of the people killed in those lifeboats on the afternoon of the 16th of September, 1942, received no official account of what had happened to their relatives during their lifetimes. There is one last detail in the documentary record of the Laconia incident that I want to close with, and it's the kind of detail that historians sometimes call a quiet revelation, a small fact that, when you encounter it, reframes everything you've just spent several hours thinking about. After the survivors were eventually transported from Casablanca and Dakar to the United States aboard the vessel Anton,
carried by a ship flying the American flag, to a country whose aircraft had bombed their rescuers, those who were military personnel returned to service. Some went back to the Atlantic. Some went to other theaters. The war continued for another 2.5 years after September 1942. Doris Hawkins returned to Britain and spent those 2.5 years visiting the families of the dead from Lifeboat 9, returning the final possessions of people she had watched die of thirst and delirium and simple exhaustion over 27 days in the South Atlantic. The Italian prisoners who survived the transit to Dakar were eventually repatriated. Janet Walker, as far as the record shows, never found out exactly what happened to Doreen. The submarines continued their patrols. Hartenstein died in March. The ice bar attack on Cape Town never happened. El Alamein was fought in October and won. And in the deep water at 4 degrees 34 minutes south, 11 degrees 25 minutes west, the coordinates the Laconia first broadcast in her distress signal, the coordinates Hartenstein reported to BDU in his first rescue signal, the coordinates that became the legal address of everything that followed, the ship sat and sits untouched in the dark. It occurs to me, having spent the better part of several months with this material, that the Laconia incident has no clean ending. The Laconia order was issued. The law evolved to prohibit the conditions that produced it. Donitz served his sentence, and Richardson kept his medals, and the rules of rescue at sea were rewritten partly because of what happened in Grid Square FF 7721 in September 1942. That's the institutional story, and it's the story that gets told when the story gets told at all. But the other story, the one Doris Hawkins went door-to-door telling, with photographs and letters and final words pressed into her hands in the dark, is not in any international convention. It doesn't have an article number. Nobody codified the obligation to carry the dead home. She just did it. And that, in the end, is the thing this incident produced that nothing else quite accounts for. A woman with a pamphlet and a list of addresses, doing what the legal frameworks and the command structures and the diplomatic negotiations and the Nuremberg proceedings could not. Accounting for the specific individual dead, one family at a time, until the list was finished.